Kære alle sammen, jeg håber, I kan høre mig. Nu er klokken blevet 16:00, og det er tid til at gå i gang. Og jeg starter lige med at introducere, vi har Amy og Kieran med, og de kommer til at holde det her foredrag om maskering. De kommer til at holde det på engelsk, så hvis I vil stille nogle spørgsmål, så må I meget gerne, hvis I kan, skrive det på engelsk, og hvis det er helt alt for besværligt med at skrive på engelsk, så skriv gerne på dansk over i chatten, og så er jeg sikker på, at vi har nogle søde medlemmer, der hjælper med at oversætte. Hvis I vil nøjes med at skrive over i den chat, vi har inde i Zoom, så vil det være lidt nemmere at samle op på spørgsmålene. Så helst undgå at skrive over i Facebook-chatten eller i Q&A, men hold jer til den chat, der er inde i Zoom. Og jeg vil sige velkommen til dem. Welcome, Kieran and Amy. You may start whenever you're ready.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen and then we can get started. Amy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so hi everyone. It is lovely to be presenting to you this afternoon. I am Dr. Amy Pearson. I am a developmental psychologist and a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Sunderland, and I am also an autistic adult.
And I'm not that posh. I'm not. I have no doctor qualifications or anything. But I was diagnosed as autistic in 2003, and I am a dad to 3 children, 2 of whom are diagnosed autistic. I'm a published mainstream and academic author, and I'm an international public speaker. And I also do lots of writing. My website's been visited by millions of people. I've got a background in special education, and I deliver my own specialist training and do consultancy for organizations all over the world. So we're here to talk about autistic masking. Before we go on, if anybody's got any questions, if there's any kind of really important questions about maybe something we've said that you haven't understood, Tinya's going to flag that, and so she'll jump in and let us know so that we can explain things a little bit differently. But otherwise, we'll kind of keep most of the questions towards the end because we've got lots of time for Q&A at the end. So if that's okay with everyone to do that. So pop your questions in the chat or the Q&A, either or, and we'll see those at the end of the talk, unless we obviously have to jump on. So what is autistic masking? Amy, would you like to start, or would you like me to jump in?
I can start with this one. So we define autistic masking a little bit differently from some of the ways you might have seen it described in the academic literature. So there's a bit of a disjoint between the way in which academics have started to describe masking and the way that autistic people have typically described masking. So we define masking as the suppression, conscious or unconscious, of autistic characteristics. That might be things like feeling like you need to make eye contact with people, even though it makes you feel really uncomfortable. It might be modulating the tone of voice or your facial expressions. And these are the kinds of things that have been mentioned in research. But it also includes things like suppressing responses to sensory information that might be really distressing, and unconsciously suppressing aspects of yourself, your personality, and your identity, in order to avoid stigma and victimization from other people.
Absolutely. I'd go one step further than that as well, because I talk a lot about projecting certain characteristics as well. So lots of people kind of talk about masking like it's a thing where you hide yourself, and the word masking kind of infers that as well. It makes people think that it is about putting on a disguise, but sometimes it's a bit more complicated than that, because sometimes it can be projecting something that people expect to see as well. So if you maybe have a child or an adult that you expect to behave in a certain way, they might lean into that expectation and become a stereotype in a little bit of a way. And so project behaviors that might not be traditionally autistic, but maybe kind of things that you might associate with ADHD or things like that, where they become a bit like the class clown, or they act up. So it's a really, really complicated kind of notion that's been a bit too simplified in a way. Is that fair to say, Amy?
I think that's incredibly reasonable. Yeah, I think one of the things that we'll probably talk about quite a bit today, is that masking is something that all humans do. So self-monitoring, changing the way that you appear in social interactions, it's something that all people do, whether they're autistic or neurotypical or neurodivergent in another way. Everybody thinks about how they appear towards others and often modulate bits of themselves depending on the context that they're in. But there's been a focus on masking in autistic people in particular, because up until fairly recently, I think there was a bit of an assumption that if someone was autistic, you would be able to tell that they were autistic, that it would be obvious to an outsider. And when researchers found out that that wasn't the case, they were really shocked that autistic people were able to fly under the radar, so to speak, whereas those sneaky autistic people who've been doing it for years were well aware that that was the case, and that you don't always appear outwardly autistic. We could probably spend a lot of time talking about what outwardly autistic looks like, and the kind of stereotypes around that. But yeah, it's definitely been oversimplified so far. There's a lot we need to know about masking that we haven't really looked at yet. And I think there's a lot more digging to do, isn't there?
Yeah, it's been a very kind of superficial glance at masking, maybe like a snapshot that hasn't dug very deep. And that's partly because, I mean, we're going to go into what the research really says on the next slide, but that is partly because the people looking at masking maybe have missed out on having that inside perspective because they're not autistic, or maybe haven't spoken to people in the right way. And another part of this as well is that when autistic people are engaged in masking, we can easily dissociate from it, which means that we're not aware that it's going on. It's kind of something we switch off from. So it's happening without us being consciously kind of aware that it's happening. So when you talk to someone about something that they're not consciously aware that they're doing, it's really difficult then for them to describe what they're doing because they're not thinking about it, and then they've never really thought about it. So it's really kind of a very, very complicated thing that needs lots more kind of looking into. There's also kind of other aspects of this as well, because on that notion, a lot of this is unconscious, which makes it really, really hard then to unpick. But because it's unconscious, it uses up a lot of energy as well. And again, we're going to come on to kind of the implications of masking later on, but it's really important that people are aware that autistic people engaging in autistic masking are using up huge amounts of energy, both mental and physical. So this is the thing that we have to really kind of work hard to keep up, even though we're not really aware that we're working hard to keep it up. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, as we would say in England. Is there anything else you'd like to add in there, Amy?
I think that probably covers what masking is. I think this is something that we'll probably talk about quite a lot more
all the way through. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty good.
I think one last thing that I'd like to add, actually, based on what you said before about people being shocked when they realised that, you know, people weren't as obviously autistic as they expected them to be. A lot of the understanding about masking is also kind of a little bit victim blaming as well, in terms of the people who were looking previously were unaware of what masking is, and were unaware that maybe they were missing obviously autistic people because they weren't quite looking for the right things. So a lot of the narrative around masking is actually kind of based on other people's problems and other people not looking in the right way as well, that's blamed then on masking. So kind of we're told that we're hiding when we're not. We're there and we're very obvious, but they're not looking for the right things. So that's a really subtle thing, but it's an important part of this narrative as well as we move on. So I'll jump on to the next slide. Right, Amy, all yours. What does the research say?
So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the research, the kind of the psychological research in this area is quite new. So, research into autistic masking, it had been covered by autistic researchers. So Damien Milton's been talking about this since his early research around kind of 2012, 2013, looking at masking in the autistic community and what people have been saying about that themselves. So he'd done a study looking at articles from a magazine called Asperger's United. And a lot of the people who were writing into this magazine talked about their experiences of masking and trying to fly under the radar, trying to blend in neurotypical society. But it didn't really pick up traction or get very much attention until an article from Sarah Bargila and Will Mandy in 2016. Sarah Bargila is an autistic researcher and conducted interviews with other autistic late diagnosed women where they talked about their experiences of trying to fit in and find ways to blend in social interactions, to prevent people from thinking that they were weird or that there was something kind of wrong with them. And this was kind of the first time the psychological sphere kind of got an insight into it and started to oh, well, this is very interesting. Autistic people haven't spoken about this before, not in the psychological literature. And so that was kind of the initial spark that set off a bit of research into this. 2017, a follow-up study came out looking at this in a bit more detail. With a paper called it was putting on my best self.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Is that the one by Laura Hull? Laura Hull and Will Mandy, and they'd done a kind of an online survey of 100 adults, and came up with this idea that masking is centered around masking itself, so kind of putting on the mask, trying to appear outwardly less autistic, assimilation, so developing strategies to fit in with other people and assimilate, so blend in with non-autistic people in social environments, and compensation, so the idea that autistic people will actively compensate for some of the things that they find difficult when they're interacting with non-autistic people. And whilst this was a really interesting piece of research for boosting interest in masking, what it did was it kind of framed masking as something that was quite deliberate, that autistic people were actively thinking about, and also framing things as compensation infers that autistic social styles are inherently flawed, rather than different to non-autistic people. So we know from Damien Milton's work in the double empathy theory that autistic people and neurotypical people don't have the same kind of social communication styles. We interact in very different ways. And by framing one side of that as impaired, what you're not taking into account is the bidirectional relationship between people. So the way in which, if I interact with a neurotypical person, the way that they interpret what I'm saying and respond to that, that's an ongoing kind of dyadic dance that we're performing. And any breakdowns in communication there go both ways. So we're constantly taking that information, integrating it. And if I'm finding it hard to understand what they're saying on the basis of the kind of information they're putting across, and then they in turn start to misinterpret what I'm saying, that can't be broken down to one of us as an individual. So the idea that autistic masking is just a case of trying to cover up difficulties interacting with non-autistic people kind of misses the point a little bit. And it assumes in a bit of an ableist way that we compensate for these social difficulties, where actually what we're trying to do is socialize with people that we don't have the same style as. So that's not necessarily compensation. It's just trying to use a non-native form of communication. I often compare this to going to a country where you don't speak the language. And if you're trying to interact with someone, you're asking them for directions, and neither of you is really understanding the other, and they're trying to point and you're trying to work out what's going on. Neither of you are impaired in that communication. You're just not speaking the same language. So interactions between autistic and non-autistic people are much like that. When autistic people are masking, though, they're trying to take on the style of those people with the non-native language. So they're trying to use that non-native communication style. So research has started to develop on this. We've had research looking into the kind of contexts in which people mask. So whether people mask more places like work and in social environments compared to when they're at home by themselves, and how this impacts on mental health. So as Kieran mentioned, masking appears to have a really negative impact on mental health and well-being. It increases anxiety and depression. We know it also increases feelings of suicidality. So this kind of having to mask and having to switch between masking and non-masking in particular, some really excellent work from Aidy Cage found that people who go from kind of not masking to masking back to not masking, that in itself, having to switch between them can be really, really difficult and find it really hard to keep up. So we kind of we have some idea coming out of what we thought masking was. We had some research looking at where masking occurs and what the kind of impacts were. But what we didn't really understand is how this fits with what autistic people have been saying about it for years, and also how it fits with social theory, which is where we came in, wasn't it?
Yeah. So when what's really interesting is, like Amy said, that the research community have only been looking at this for really the past 5 or 6 years, and increasingly so over the last probably 2 years, maybe it's fair to say. The autistic community has been talking about masking since the mid 1990s. So we're a little bit ahead of where the research kind of narrative is. But like with anything, nothing humanity can do can exist without research to say that it's permissible to do so. But so to come away from an academic viewpoint onto it, and from a kind of a feelings and emotional viewpoint on this, the first time the term was really used was actually by a Swedish autistic lady called Gunilla Gerlund, who published a book in about 1996. And she described what's become kind of the traditional autistic view of what masking is. Now, we come at it from a very different angle from what Amy's described there, because Amy's described, these processes that are about choice, that are about, wanting to fit in and wanting to blend in. Actually, the autistic community has come at this from a very different angle, where we use words like safety and fear and marginalization and no choice and scared, and it's all about, Amy and I have looked at this from a very kind of narrative of trauma and invalidation. So this is more about autistic people that have been multiply invalidated by the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we move, the way that we communicate, the way that literally we exist is invalidated all the time, constantly. We're told that we're not behaving in the right way. We're told to communicate differently. And even if we're not directly told those things, we are subliminally told those things. It's kind of a societal pressure to act in certain ways. So all of those things create what I would describe as a trauma response, which is really what I see masking as. It's this kind of shell that we build up around ourselves over time. And that's why I think the dissociativeness of it is really, really important, because when we've built that shell around us, it's then really hard to kind of unpick from that shell and pick it up and put it down. It's not just a series of social strategies, as research has been kind of indicating. It's not something that we pick up and we put on and then we take off again. It's something that's with us all the time, and actually something that quite often we're still engaging in when we're not around other people. It's still something that we carry with us. So it's a kind of, that's where the autistic community has come from with this. And lots of us for a while now have had concerns about where the research narrative has gone, because of other aspects around things like gender and stuff like that, and the things that have come into it from that way, which again, we will touch on. So this is why Amy and I really got together, and some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware. We recently published the paper that you can see on the slide there, that we called "Understanding the Narrative of Stigma and the Illusion of Choice," which really actually sums up where we feel the research narrative is currently going. So, Amy, do you want to lead us into that a little bit more, and the kind of whys and wherefores?
Yeah, so Kieran and I had been talking for a little while about masking when we first met. It's one of the first things that we started talking about. And then a little while later, I was talking to Kieran about some data that I collected as part of a study. So back in 2018, I think it was, before there was a lot of research in this area, there were only, again, 1 or 2 papers. And I conducted some research with a student. We had looked at experiences of masking in autistic, neurodivergent, but not autistic, and non-autistic people, or people without a diagnosis of anything. I am loath to say not autistic, because I'm pretty sure some of the people were. And we looked at this across gender. So we had kind of men, women, and non-binary participants took part in this research. And I spoke to Kieran and I was like, the results from this are really complex. They paint a much more complex picture of masking than we've seen in the literature so far. And it got us really talking about the theory behind masking, and how actually there was very little theoretical groundwork laid for what we might expect. So, as I said on the first slide, the idea that we change who we appear to be when we socialize with other people is something that social psychologists have been looking at in non-autistic people for decades. So it's something that we've got a lot of research into, but there's absolutely nothing in autistic people. And part of that comes from this idea that autistic people don't care about social affiliation, that they're not interested in social relationships, that they're not interested in other people. So why would we need social psychology and social psychological explanations for autism and autistic people in the way that they act?
Can I just clarify that that is not true, that we do really enjoy social situations? Just if there was any doubt there.
So
sorry,
we
I just pushed off your train of thought there.
Like you got it in my script. No, so we really started talking about these social ideas, so all of this social psychological theory, and how it links very heavily to what we knew about masking, and kind of the idea that we're drawing up on these very unconscious processes often when we're socializing with other people, the way in which we moderate ourselves carefully between different situations. And we don't know anything about that in autistic people. So we know that autistic people mask, but we don't know anything really aside from what we know about ourselves in terms of the kind of the native social rules that autistic people have, and the native social psychological explanations for the way in which autistic people act both with each other and other non-autistic people. So there's been very, very little social psychological investigation into autistic people. And we kind of sat and we thought about this, and we're like, well, masking can be explained by a lot of these social theories, but there's been no application of them. So no one's looked at how autistic people monitor their social identity, and no one's looked at how that identity develops within the context that we live in, how it's influenced by the kind of interactions we have, and that developmental aspect of it. So growing up either autistic and knowing you're autistic in a world that stigmatizes autistic people, or growing up not knowing that you're autistic and not knowing why you don't fit in and being stigmatized because you're weird and having to try to find ways to fit in because of that. So it really seemed like that was missing. And we wanted to address that. We wanted to try and lay the groundwork for some really good social theory and start essentially building up a social psychology, a social theory for autistic people, instead of applying rules that and theory that we've had for non-autistic people and saying autistic people are impaired, they don't interact in these ways. We find explanations that from the ground up fit the way autistic people interact with each other. So it's a different kind of explanation.
Yeah.
The other thing that we really wanted to get at was gender, which we'll come on to, I think, a little bit later in this talk. But we really kind of weren't fans of some of the discussions that were going on around masking and women, because a lot of the discussions there really draw heavily upon stereotype. And again, they feed into this idea that autism looks like one particular thing, and if it doesn't look like that particular thing, it's a different kind of autism. It's all autism. We're all autistic. We just look like individuals because we are individuals. Humans are complex and varied, and autistic people are humans, contrary to quite popular belief. So we wanted to try and address that as well, didn't we?
Yeah. And what's been really interesting is the paper that we've published has actually had an amazing reception, but it didn't feel like we were writing anything that was anything more than common sense. And that was and maybe that's because we are both autistic, and maybe that's because we come at this from an autistic perspective. Because when we hear lots of the narratives around autism, you know, that we don't engage in social interaction, we don't like other people, we prefer to be by ourselves, and all of those kind of things, which are very stigmatizing and not based on truth necessarily, or certainly not a wide truth, a very narrow truth. That when we came to write this paper, it was actually kind of like, why has nobody else thought about these things? And the reason that they've not thought about these things is actually where we're going to get to onto the next slide, which is all of this. So if there are any words on there that you kind of that you're not able to read or that you don't understand, just maybe make a note in the chat, and Tinya can jump up and we can explain any of them if we don't cover them. But before we kind of go too deeply into all of these different things, I want to touch on what Amy said about the kind of the social theory, because the word social is really key to all of this, and things like social expectations and social norms are very, very centered on non-autistic experience, absolutely centered on non-autistic experience. So when things are centered on a particular group of people, that particular group of people are a majority, then it's very easy for that particular group of people to kind of look at the minority groups around them that don't act the way that they do and say, well, you're not like us, so that means that you've got deficits in being us, without kind of realizing that we live in a world which is very diverse and has multitudes of diversity in every aspect of living creatures. But in humanity, we have a very narrow view of what humans look like and what humans should behave like. So really kind of this is that concept underpins all of this, because as autistic people, we are othered, we are set to one side, we are held in comparison against the neurotypical, for want of a better word, majority group. And then because we're held against that group, yes, we do have deficits in being like that group, but that group also has deficits in being like us. And that's what's missing from the kind of the whole narrative around autism, and it's what underpins this masking narrative. So, Amy, do you want to play Lucky Dip?
I do. I'm like, it sounds really wrong to say like, oh, there's so many of my favorite topics here, because they're all incredibly bleak. But no, I will. Which one am I going to choose first? That's really good. I just wanted to pick up on what you said there for a moment before I do pick one. About kind of the us being impaired at appearing like neurotypical people. And it made me think of a discussion I had a couple of weeks ago with a friend who's also going through the diagnostic process as kind of a woman in her 30s. I was like, what's the term? It's not middle-aged. But yeah, as another woman in her 30s. And she'd said to me, she was trying to kind of frame autism in her head and was really trying to think about it. And she was like, so if more people were autistic and less people were neurotypical, would neurotypical then be the neurodivergent ones and autistic would be the neurotypical? And I was like, well, technically, yes, because that's how that works. It's all to do with the statistical majority and what appears to be normal, according to statistics. But if autistic people were the majority, then yeah, the current neurotypicals would be the one that diverged from that. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about how artificial that is in terms of these rules set up for autistic behavior and appearance, and the idea of impairment and deficit is very much grounded around this idea of there being an objective norm, and there isn't an objective norm. So I am going to choose we'll go with internalized ableism. We'll just go like with the very first one on there.
Okay.
Because
so what's ableism, first of all?
Do you want me to? Was that a rhetorical or a question?
No, that was a. What's ableism, Amy?
So ableism is it's multifarious. So it's the experience of taking a particular characteristic that's often associated with a disability and viewing that as particularly negative or something bad.
Okay. So that narrative there that Amy just described about, you identify someone who's disabled and you think negatively about them because of that disability. And sometimes that's an open thought, and sometimes that's an unconscious thought that people just carry. Internalized ableism is when we take that thought when we are disabled and we apply it to ourselves. And again, it's one of these things that we don't necessarily realize that we're doing. But when you are constantly being surrounded by people who are saying, you can't do things because of A, B, or C, or you should be able to do things, or you're lazy, or you're all of those kind of things that disabled people hear constantly, you know, that or that we give them pity, or that, you know, it's like, oh, it's such a shame that you know that you don't work properly. All of those kind of things that we hear, we take that on as our own story, and we feel negatively about ourselves because of that. So when you feel negatively about being autistic, which we are, whether we are identified as autistic or whether we're not identified as autistic, because even when we don't know that we're autistic, we're still being treated negatively for being autistic. This again can cause us to project what I would say is an acceptable version of ourselves. And then when we carry that projected version of ourselves all the time, the real you kind of gets lost underneath. And it's interesting that even as myself, someone who's been diagnosed and aware that I'm autistic for nearly 20 years now, I still trip over my internalized ableism every day. I still doubt myself. I doubt that I'm autistic sometimes. I doubt that I'm saying the right thing sometimes, even talking like this, which I have a vast knowledge of, both of us do. I still doubt that I'm saying the right things some of the time, you know, because it's like, am I just making this up? Is it just something I've dreamt? And even like one morning I might get up and I might think, well, yesterday I made 10 phone calls and I spoke to 20 different people and I went to the shops and I did all these wonderful things. And then by the end of the next day, I might not be able to even get up and out of bed because I'm exhausted from the day before. But yesterday I was able to do those things. So there must be something wrong with me because I can't do those things today. And that's a really negative self-view that's easily described by the fact that I did lots of things and overextended myself and therefore burnt myself out, which is the real thing that's happening. But I self-blame. And it's really, really easy to kind of fall into that trap. So that's one out of obviously a lot of different aspects of masking. So should we pick another one?
Yeah,
I don't think we're going to have time to go through all of them.
I know. Well, I think the really important thing to say about these is they're all interlinked.
Yes,
like you cannot isolate any of these factors. So, and this is something that, so alongside masking, a lot of the research I do looks at things like relationships, bullying and victimization, and abuse in autistic adults in particular. And a lot of the experiences that people have had, a lot of these really awful social experiences relate to these other factors. So things like invalidation, self-protection and compliance in order to try and stay safe, fawning and experiences of trauma, being marginalized. So they're all interactive and all interlinked. It's something that you can't pick like anything in isolation. And understand the experience of masking without thinking about all of these things together. But I'll go for sensory invalidation, because I think that's actually a really under-discussed one and something really important.
It is, and you've annoyed me now because I'm going to go really heavy on that in the next slide. But we will touch on it because it is really, really important. So when you exist as an autistic person, now, autism and the sensory system are so closely connected. It's part and parcel of the same thing. Because lots of people think about autism being in our brains, and then they think about our brains being in our head, but actually our brain is in our entire body because of our central nervous system. So our brain's actually a huge organ that goes out all over our body and touches every kind of far part of you. And all of that is autistic. That's our neurology. So when we take in sensory information, we actively, as autistic people, process more sensory information than non-autistic people because there are filters there that non-autistic people use to stop being overwhelmed by that sensory information. As an autistic person, we're processing lots and lots of sensory information all the time. So that means that we experience sensory information differently to non-autistic people. Sometimes we under appreciate it, sometimes we over appreciate it. You know, it's very, very in our faces or it's not there at all. So we tend to be at the more extreme kind of ends of the sensory experience. So when you exist like that and you are surrounded by people who do not exist like that, it's very easy for those people to say, oh, you know, you'll be fine, you'll get over it, it's not that bad, all of those kind of things. But when it's something that causes you pain, and you are being effectively dismissed by people who are telling you that it's not that bad and you'll get over it and it's not important, that's a really difficult thing for you to process. And actually what that teaches us is not to listen to our own bodies. And when our bodies are telling us that we're in pain, but everybody else is telling us that we are not in pain, you kind of gaslight yourself. And again, that comes back to internalized ableism. Again, it becomes another narrative around that. Like Amy said, they're all interconnected, that actually you don't listen to your body. So therefore you push yourself beyond what your body is actually capable of, and all of these kind of things. And they all have a hugely negative impact on you. But you are in the process, when other people invalidate you, of suppressing your sensory self. And our sensory selves are, as human beings, the most important aspect of who we are. We could not live without our senses. So when you're taught not to listen to your senses and you suppress your sensory reactions because people invalidate you, that becomes a huge part of the masking narrative. And it's another reason why we're using up so much energy. I've stopped monologuing now.
No, I think that's really important. And I mean, you know firsthand from the discussions that we've had, this has been a massive issue for me personally. So it's something that, for me, I've had to learn about myself. And, you know, as an adult, I have had kind of the ability from quite young adulthood to be very independent in the kind of the decisions that I made about my life. And so I structured my entire life around things that made me comfortable without really thinking about why I did these things. Yeah. So I only went to certain supermarkets because I liked the lighting in there more. And I would wear particular headphones and go at particular times, as an example. And I'd never really thought about it. I just kind of, that's how I'd always done things. And then I had a kind of an incident not long before I met Kieran, where I'd gone to a supermarket at a really busy time. And I had my headphones in and I walked in and I got my shopping list out, and suddenly the music felt too loud in my ears and the people felt like they were moving too quickly, and I got really disoriented and really dizzy, and I kind of stood and froze in the supermarket and didn't know what to do. And then I started panicking and thinking I'm going to have to move because people are going to get really annoyed at me. And I managed to get myself to like a really quiet aisle and stay there for a moment and, you know, calm down. What's happened to me? Finished my shop and got home, and I said to my partner, and he kind of went, "It's because you're autistic." And I was like, oh. And this was before I'd realized and things had clicked into place for me. And not being able to identify sensory stressors because I didn't have that self-knowledge meant that I put myself in situations, you know, I'd sometimes get very surprised by my own response, because I would think, why am I feeling so stressed right now? And that kind of invalidation that I experienced as a child around particular things like not liking certain textures or not liking certain noises, it kind of gotten me to this point where I'd been able to control so much of it that I'd never thought about it, that I just couldn't identify sensory stress. And again, that relationship between internalized ableism and sensory invalidation got to the point where that mask started breaking down because those coping mechanisms that I had developed just went.
There's an interesting point there as well that actually throws us back to what I said at the beginning about people missing autistic people and the blame being put on the fact that they mask. Now, you have an autistic brother, don't you, who was diagnosed autistic at an early age?
Yes.
So when I said earlier about people missing autistic people because, you know, they might be masking, or it's about people not seeing what they expect to see in an autistic person, you're a prime example of that, because you existed to an extent as an autistic person. You were putting accommodations in for yourself unknowingly, but actually you were missed. And this is a really, really kind of important point here, which is a little bit off of the main point, but, you know, I do like a tangent sometimes. That it's really, really important that those of you that are kind of listening to this that have children and have one autistic child, sorry, it's really easy to think that that's what autism looks like. We create a kind of confirmation bias within ourselves. And so then it becomes really easy to kind of miss or other autistic siblings and brothers and sisters and things, because you have this view of what autism looks like because it's there in front of you in this one child. And then it's kind of, you kind of can make excuses for the other children. Oh, that's just them, or they're a little bit quirky or whatever. And actually what you're seeing is an autistic person, but they're not masking from you necessarily. It's that you can't see them because you're not looking at them through that lens. And this is again something else that's kind of, this is embedded in the autism narrative, because had the researchers that are currently doing the research looked at Amy growing up, or looked at Amy and her brother, they would have seen her brother but missed Amy. And that isn't necessarily because you're a girl, and I know we're going to go on to that, aren't we? But you know, it isn't necessarily because of that. It's because maybe Amy presented in a slightly different way that they didn't expect to see, because they always fall back on what the traditional view of what autism is. And so that's a really important part of all this masking narrative anyway, that it's as much about how people view the autistic person as it is about what the autistic person presents like as well. That's another dynamic to it. And again, that's a dynamic that's kind of been missed. But can we do social skills? Because I think that's really kind of an important one in all of this. Now, we live in a social world, obviously. You know, we are people, we integrate and on various levels, and that's where society comes from. But around that, we seem to have developed these really, I'm going to say, odd rituals that human beings engage in with each other, in terms of, you know, we have rules apparently in society that we have to do things in a certain way and say things in a certain way. Now, something that again comes from the autistic community is lots of autistic people describe growing up and almost like it's everybody else had a set of this rule book and that they didn't as autistic people. That's certainly how I would have described it years ago, you know, that everybody else seemed to know what was going on and I didn't have a clue what was going on when it came to social interactions. So the problem that we have is that society, in a way, is a bit like a social therapy, in that we are all expected to do things in particular ways because society says that we have to do things in particular ways. But there's no real there's no real kind of foundations to that. There's nothing underpinning any of that. It's just stuff that we've done over the years that's become kind of ingrained. But now we have all these social skills therapies that autistic children are expected to go to often, where they are taught how to be non-autistic, basically. And it's missing a whole load of balance, because Amy said a really, really important thing earlier about it's like taking one person and putting them in another country and talking in a different language and not knowing what that language is and not knowing the kind of cultural expectations and things like that. Now, that does happen. I mean, at the moment, we're in Denmark. Which is great and lovely. We don't speak Danish, unfortunately. So we're very fortunate that everybody here does speak English and probably speaks English better than us to a degree. But if we were to come to Denmark, there would be hopefully an expectation that we would try to speak Danish, that we would respect Danish culture. But when you are autistic and you are taken to that other place, there is an expectation that you speak in that language. There is an expectation that you respect that culture, but there's also an extra expectation that you leave your language and culture behind and never ever use it again. And that's what social skills training does. It's the imposition of one culture over another culture. And that might seem really strange to talk about autism as a culture, but within the autistic community, we have all the things going on that are the markers of culture. We have art, we have science, we have stories, we have cuisine, we have our own social dynamics, we have our own ways of moving and thinking and feeling, and we have all sorts of different things that make a culture that would be definable as culture. But all of that we are expected to put aside because of social skills training, because of social norms. Now, the silly thing is, when I said earlier about social skills aren't underpinned by anything, if I took myself to Amy's house, Amy will have expectations of how I should behave in Amy's house because that's how she behaves in Amy's house. I might have different expectations of how I should behave. If I go to another country and behave the way that I do in England, I might cause problems because it's not the way that people in that country behave. Now, those social norms, they change geographically, they change from household to household, they change from person to person. So how can you then teach something which changes constantly and isn't underpinned by anything? You can't. And actually, when it comes to autistic children, often autistic children are taught to do things in a non-autistic way that non-autistic people don't even do. Eye contact is a huge one. Eye contact is massive in the cultural narrative of Western autism. That autistic people are expected to make eye contact. Now, if you go to other countries in Europe, I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but certain countries in Europe, eye contact is not a big thing at all. In England, eye contact is everything. If you do not make eye contact, there's something wrong with you. You're a criminal. You're suspicious. You know, you're doing all these really negative things, all because you don't want to look at someone's eyeballs. But then, you know, and also all of this is underpinned by just made up stuff. But yet all of it we are expected to do, and all of it we try really, really hard to engage in when we are masking. And it's not our natural way of behaving. It's not what we naturally need to do. And again, I'm very aware that I'm monologue, which is natural autistic communication.
I was going to say, like, I personally think that's okay. But that's kind of how we communicate. So, no, you're absolutely right. Like, as you say, one of the things that really struck me years back was we had a talk when I was a student from Atsushi Senju, who was Japanese, and he was talking about eye tracking data and looking at eye gaze direction and eye contact in autistic children. And he was saying that in Japan, making eye contact with people, particularly making too much eye contact with people, is thought of as impolite. And it really got me thinking then about, you know, our kind of the Western cultural imposition of normality in how we consider autism and a variety of other different things in marginalized communities in general. And I think that it does feed into that idea that a lot of the ideas we have about what autism stereotypically looks like isn't anything to do with autism and what autism actually looked like. It's to do with how we've interpreted autism through a neurotypical lens and neurotypical social rules that surround that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we need to pick out any more? Or do you think we can safely move on?
I think we can probably safely move on.
We can probably
we'll probably talk about some of these, I think, throughout anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, I am not an academic in any way, shape, or form, but what I am is a writer. So, so this plays to my strengths. I've written a script for this bit, which I quite often do when I do presentations. I don't often do presentations like this. I usually kind of script my presentations out, because then I know that I can edit what I'm going to say. I know exactly what I'm going to say. It's safe for me to kind of do it, and I know I'm not going to miss anything out. So bear with me. I'm going to go through the origins of masking here. So masking has its origins in the earliest of socialization, and it's rooted in sensory and communication differences. How the mask presents itself is very much based on the notion of internalizers and externalizers. So an internalizer is the one who has a tendency to turn inward and internalize their being autistic. And the externalizers are the ones who turn outward. So they externalize being autistic. They're more obviously autistic. So as one example in this and how it starts, if you consider an undiagnosed autistic baby, and yes, they do exist, and we never ever talk about autistic babies. What if that baby finds touch uncomfortable, or worse, has a sensory response of pain upon touch? Babies are put through a constant cycle of touch. They're picked up, put down, wiped, prodded, cuddled, poked. And what's the only way that they can communicate that this is hurting them? They cry. So then what happens? They're picked up, put down, wiped, prodded, cuddled, poked. If you continue that cycle, eventually the baby unconsciously is going to figure out that no matter what it does, the touching is not going to stop. It doesn't then become desensitized to the touching. It stops reacting in the unconscious hope that the touching is going to become minimalized. So even that baby is suppressing, it's protecting itself, and it's complying. So it's already learning how to mask. And that's very much framed around the sensory invalidation that we were talking about just before. So later that child is taken to places filled with other babies and toddlers, and there's groups and nursery, preschools and kindergartens. Amidst the sensory overstimulation of this new environment, the child starts to figure out it's not like the other children, that acting in certain ways will cause that child to be punished or singled out by the other children, or that other children act in certain ways that get rewarded. The child finds that complaints about the sensory environment lead to them being dismissed. That's even if they can be communicated at all. So often they start to mirror the others. There's no context to what they're copying. They just know that everyone else is acting in a certain way, and then they get favored for it. Eye contact in England brings praise no matter how much it hurts. Sitting perfectly still brings praise no matter how much you need to move in order to concentrate. Your interests are invalidated. You're told to stop talking at length, that you have to converse like the other children. You're told to stop moving in certain ways, and so on and so on. The child then moves on to school, where social situations become more complex. The ability to exist authentically is almost gone already by this point. Children are put into social skills groups where they're taught how to fit in and make everyone else feel comfortable. They struggle to understand the communication that's going on around them, and nobody bothers to learn their way of communicating or validates their way of communicating. They're taught to ignore what their body is telling them when the sensory environment is more overstimulating and more painful. The child is dismissed when they complain that things are too loud or that their clothes hurt them, so they stop complaining. The expectation to sit and engage and comply and conform increases, and then so does the masking. Adults question the child's behaviours when they're deemed negative or inappropriate, and very quickly the child learns to subdue them, or alternatively they create new behaviours, projecting a persona of clownishness or non-compliance to redirect this. In the words of one autistic person, I polished my not normal till it shone and showed it off. A better response for me was always to out myself. So when the discomfort, annoyance, and fragility at my existence occurred in other people, I could name it for them and be everything they wanted me to be. Otherwise, if they weren't uncomfortable or annoyed, I wouldn't even know if I was in the room. People know I'm different and they don't like it. If I tried to hide it, things would be worse because they'd know I was different and not know why, which scares them even more. This is all wrapped up in showing the observer what they expect to see. The development of the mask in children is everywhere. It exists in phrases that you'll all have heard or even said, such as sit still, quiet hands, look at me, eyes to the front. Well, everyone else enjoyed it. It's not that bad. You'll get over it. Stop making such a fuss. They were smiling, so they must have liked it. If they can do it, so can you. Well, nobody else minded it. You don't need that. Stop making that noise. You don't really feel like that. You need to learn to behave. Why are you so angry? It's a constant cycle of invalidation and expectations put onto autistic children that other children aren't expected to conform to. The autistic brain is monotropic, which means it has an interest-driven and problem-solving focus. If nobody can give you a good reason as to why you're feeling different or why you have problems in your life, and everyone around you is dismissing your feelings or not recognizing your pain, the only solution to this problem that you can come up with is that you are the problem, that you're broken in some way. To further back this up, when you turn to the literature, the conversations, the training, when you look at autism through most mediums, it's solely focused on how autistic people are broken, how we fail to communicate properly, how we don't fit in, how we show challenging behavior, how our thoughts and movements and reactions upset other people, and so on. Everything about the autism narrative is all centered on how our existence on every level is a problem for the gold standard human being. And even if the child isn't identified as autistic, they're still registering as autistic in the minds of the people observing them, but just without the label, just by existing. And this is all being backed up in research now as well, where non-autistic people have been proven to make what are known as thin slice judgments about autistic people, regardless of whether we are internalizers or externalizers, when encountering one of us for the first time, even if they don't know we're autistic. Experiences with us make non-autistic people unconsciously uncomfortable, and there's a tendency for them to act negatively based on that. Autistic people experience the same feelings with non-autistic people, but tend to do the opposite. We go out of our way to make the non-autistic person feel comfortable by projecting an acceptable version of ourselves. What this behavior does over time is hand the autistic child an internal narrative of internalized ableism, a voice which says, you can't do this. You shouldn't be like this. This is your fault. The internal voice that we inherit from the world around us is, I'm not good enough. I need to change. I need to improve. I need to get better. I need to stop melting down. I need to stop making mistakes. I need to sit still. I need to listen. I need to work harder at being like everyone else. Why do I get picked on? I shouldn't feel like this. Why am I the only one in pain? Why am I different? I need to understand better. But nobody understands us. Not really. We're expected to meet everyone else's demands and needs, many of which don't even make sense. We're put through social skills training so that we can learn to mask better and be better like everyone else. We are expected to change. We're expected to do all the work. We're expected to grow into those gold standard humans because we aren't that gold standard human. We're broken, so we feel wrong. We turn on ourselves and eat ourselves up. We gorge on things like shame and othering and stigma and hold it in our bellies where it festers and grows. From that autistic baby to this autistic adult, this is the trauma that creates the mask. Not an easy thing to hear and not an easy thing to read or write either, but it is a generalized kind of experience of what it feels like to start masking at a very, 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 very early age, and then how it develops over the course of your lifetime. And all of that's focused on children, and these things continue into our adulthood and as we kind of get older and older and older. And the scary thing is that so many late diagnosed people find out that they're autistic, whether they're identified by professionals or whether they experience it themselves and kind of come to this conclusion themselves. And then we talk about kind of unmasking within the autistic community, and they are terrified that what's underneath that mask is nothing, that there's this just great big void underneath. And that's a really common theme that late diagnosed autistic adults talk about, that they don't know who they are because they've been projecting this version of themselves that's just built up around them like a shell their whole lives, and they don't know what's going on underneath. And it's a terrifying thing. So yeah, do you want to add anything there, Amy, or is that enough?
So I'll add, I think an interesting thing that I would say on top of that. So I like, as a developmental psychologist, so as someone who has studied kind of development from birth into adulthood, you know, we learn a lot of our behaviors from our caregivers, from the people around us. And one thing that we think is discussed somewhat less, and I hope that more research and more discussion starts to spring up around this, is that there are a lot of unidentified autistic people who raise autistic children.
Yeah.
And those people will either kind of, I guess you can have a situation where someone does not mask that much. They don't know they're autistic. They know maybe people think they're weird, but they're just like, whatever. Mm-hmm. And they raise their child with that kind of, you know, pride in their weirdness. But also the child isn't weird in their home because the whole family's like that. So that's the way everyone acts. Or you have parents who see the child behaving like they might have done as a child and think that didn't bring anything good for me, so I'm going to teach you not to do that.
Yeah.
And so you have this situation in which the child's learning either those masking behaviors or to kind of be more their authentic selves based on the way in which their parents behave. And it's only once that the child starts to maybe attend school and other people start picking up on the fact that they appear different, that autism gets brought up. And then many parents, when they take their child through the diagnostic process, kind of start to think, oh, this is very much like me and I fit all of these criteria as well. So I think considering that familial relationship there as well is really important. That masking begins in childhood, but it is also, it is developmental. It's something that we do learn socially. It is a form of social behavior. And this is, it's a bit like a conversation I had with my own mum. So currently going through the diagnostic process. I've had kind of one assessment point, and I'm still awaiting another due to our incredibly prolonged system that we have here. But I spoke to my mum and I asked her some questions about my very early childhood. And I said, did I have any problems with, kind of routine and uncertainty around routine? And she said to me, she was like, no, you were absolutely fine. Oh, but I also narrated everything we were doing. So there was never any uncertainty. I would tell you, well, next we're going to be doing this, and then we're going to be doing this. And in 5 minutes, we'll be doing this activity. I thought I was like, okay, so you unknowingly had all of these kind of adjustments in place, because that's just the way.
Which is exactly what you did for
you
did that for yourself as well, though, didn't you? So that's also a learned behavior that she'd kind of empowered you to be able to put all these adjustments in place for yourself to a degree. And that's interesting. She would never look at you as autistic, despite the fact that you had an autistic brother who was diagnosed.
Yeah, despite the fact that she raised it with the health visitor very, very early on in childhood. When I didn't play with other children, I would only play next to them. And she said to the health visitor, "What's going on?" And the health visitor was like, "Oh, she'll be fine once she starts school," which I think again feeds into the idea that they'll learn to fit in, or they won't, and either one of those is going to have a negative impact.
Cool. Right, let's move on to the next bit, because this is also a big one, and I'm conscious of time as well. We don't want to keep you here for the rest of the year, and we could quite easily. So, so does masking present differently in different groups? That's a question for you, Amy.
It is a question for me. So I am not representative of many different groups of people. Like, please be kind about this drawing, because I drew it and I'm not the best illustrator. I was going to say drawer, but that's not really a word. But yeah, I'm not the best at drawing, but this was my attempt to capture the fact that autistic people don't look a particular way. A lot of psychologists in particular had this idea that autistic people were white male children that never grew into adults, and that they were lonely, and that they didn't speak to anybody else, and they didn't communicate, and they were only interested in trains and dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are awesome, and I can see why anyone would be interested in dinosaurs. They're phenomenal. But they had this very narrow idea. So this is my attempt to capture that. Anybody can be autistic. Autism doesn't have a gender, it doesn't have a race or ethnicity, it doesn't have a particular sexuality. Autistic people, as we said at the start, are as varied as everybody else. Now, in terms of masking and how it presents differently in different groups, I can speak as a white, cisgender, non-heterosexual woman. But I obviously don't know what it's like to mask as a Black woman, or as a transgender person, or someone who is non-binary or Asian. I can't speak for those groups, so I don't represent them, and I don't know what it's like to experience marginalization because of those factors or features of myself, my identity. But as an autistic woman who wasn't identified as a child, despite displaying quite clearly autistic characteristics in many ways, I do think it's important that we have this conversation about how masking it might present differently, but it's not because of a different kind of autism. It's not because I have shiny female autism and Kieran has regular autism that I get a kind of a diet lady autism. It's because people are different, and autism looks different in different people because people are individuals. But those individuals are also socialized in different ways. So the kind of external characteristics that people notice about us, that might be things like our gender, our hair color, our skin color, and eye color, all of those external factors, they influence how people treat us and how they respond to us. And the way in which they treat us, again, then we internalize that information and we present ourselves more or less based on that. So when we're socialized maybe to be polite, to not run around and play in the mud, to not play with cars as a girl, I luckily didn't have these experiences so much. So I wasn't particularly kind of push towards overly feminine things as a child. I loved dinosaurs, lizards, cars, and like Lego, and those are pretty much like the things that I did. If I lined all of my toy puppies up, no one was judging that, because you can put dogs in a particular order, like you're going to show them at a dog show. But all of these things, they kind of they impact on how people view autism. So it's not necessarily that the autism is different. It's like you're different and people can't see it because of their idea of a stereotype. So as a woman, it might be that I have learned how to interact in certain ways. I have learned how to portray myself in certain ways. And that might mean that other people don't view me as stereotypically autistic. That's not because I'm not. It's because people don't view my actions like that. Instead, you just get labeled as quirky or adorable or weird if people don't like you. It very much depends on that external viewpoint. So masking can present differently, but it's not because it's different autism or that women are better at masking. And that's I think that's one of the things that often we get wrong, is that we say women are better at masking than men. Women are better at masking. Say, no, a lot of women have just been socialized to be very polite and to portray themselves as very empathic and to show that they will be very compliant and pleasing to other people. That's not something that's necessarily the case for all women. And it's not something that men don't necessarily experience. Many men, non-binary people and trans people also go through the same thing. But it might be something that's more associated with the experience of being female. And so what we do is we create these artificial categories where we go, well, this is what autistic women are like. They're good at hiding their autism. They wear makeup so they look like other women, and they have stereotypically normal interests. Like they're interested in things like Taylor Swift and bands instead of trains and dinosaurs. I know plenty of autistic women who are really into trains and dinosaurs. And I know plenty of autistic men who are into Taylor Swift and particular bands. But it's to do with how our characteristics are interpreted through that normative lens. So if you're a teenage girl and you are really into a particular band, and you're like a massive fan, that's viewed as quite normal teenage girl behavior. So it's like, okay, well, you're obsessed with this band, you want to go and see them, you scream if you see them in a stadium, you've got their posters all over your wall. No one thinks of that as odd.
That's acceptable, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not odd. I mean, it's having interest isn't odd, and I would never want to suggest that they are, but that level of interest is just seen as normal. Whereas if you've got an interest in something that doesn't fit that narrow definition, then that's when people start to think of that as a bit strange. And that socialization where you're encouraged to think about what other people think of you, because that's what girls are bothered about. They're bothered about what other people think of them. That's the thing that interacts and drives this, that idea we have about gender. So yeah, it's a lot more complicated than women are better at masking. And what that does is it really minimizes the experiences of autistic women, men, and non-binary people, because it kind of just anyone who doesn't fit the gender binary is just left out on the side anyway. And men who don't fit the stereotype, well, do they have female autism?
That's actually become a thing now, though, hasn't it? That and again, obviously, you know, we're talking to people from another country right now. I'm conscious of that, but in the UK, actually, those are the kind of things that diagnosticians are telling parents. That I've seen so many parents reporting that their son's just been diagnosed and they've been told he's got a female autism. You know, which is just confusing. It's absolutely confusing, and he hasn't got a female. He's autistic. That's what's going on there. But just because he doesn't present in the way that they expect him to present, because of a multitude of different reasons, and this is the key thing here as well, that it comes back to identity, doesn't it? And this is why identity is so important in the autism narrative. That your identities are built out of the different things that you do and the way that you're brought up and the things that you think about and your job and whether you're a parent or not a parent, whether you're a brother or a sister, and so on and so on. All of these things are wrapped up in your identity. But because the identity aspect is not included when people are diagnosed, it's whether do you explicitly portray these set of behaviors. And if you don't do those things in the traditional way as they have been viewed over the last kind of 90, 100 years, that we've been looking at autistic people, then that means that there's an assumption there that there's different autisms, which is actually where the narrative is taking us, because we've been here before, haven't we? The creation of Asperger's syndrome, that diagnosis was created out of necessity because basically people wanted to gatekeep what autism looked like. So a whole new diagnosis had to be created. And actually, we've realized now, this is why Asperger's syndrome has been taken out of the diagnostic manuals, because we've realized now that autism is a broader thing than people originally thought. And it exists in multiple ways because of individuality, because we are individual humans who are socialized in different ways and have different co-occurring conditions and all of these things that play into what people think is autism, but actually isn't autism. And they've come up, and now that there's this is again why Amy and I really wanted to include that in our paper about gender, because this female autism phenotype, which is what is actually being discussed it's almost being presented as a completely different type of autism, when it's not at all. It's just an autistic person who's presenting in a particular way because of particular reasons about their individuality. But we have the same issue again over kind of different races and ethnicities as well, don't we? Because it's kind of, and again, this is a very UK centric kind of view, and it's a US centric one as well. If you are Black, you are more likely to get a diagnosis of ADHD or oppositional defiance disorder than you are an autism diagnosis. And that's framed around a narrative of Black people have behavioral problems. You know, we're all probably aware of the trope of the angry Black woman, and that Black people are more likely to be involved in crime. But you have to look at that in context, and in context of Black people who have been marginalized and oppressed. And there's historical racism and systemic racism and all of the things that play into these narratives. But all those things are excluded because we only look at certain people through certain lenses that are informed by awful narratives and historical kind of ways of thinking that are fundamentally flawed and problematic, but are never looked at. And that's all of this is being kind of excluded here, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Like you say, I think a lot of this, it's historical racism and sexism that feeds into how we view these things. And the way in which we interpret it. I did see a study recently that showed exactly that if you take a case study example of a child and you give that case study to a particular person and ask them to assess whether they think that child is autistic or has conduct disorder, if the child is framed as white, they will be seen as autistic. And if the child is Black, they'll be seen as having a label of conduct disorder. And that shows how flimsy the diagnostic criteria are for both of those things, but also how someone's identity and how marginalized that person is can impact then on how someone perceives them, but then also the kind of the way in which that person's referred to support afterwards, and gets a more stigmatizing label. I was going to give an example before when you were talking about characteristics and how they look different in different people. And because I like to bring everything back to baking, the example I would relate this though to baking in terms of cakes, biscuits, muffins, like all of these different kinds of baked goods are made out of exactly the same ingredients. They just express in slightly different ways. So it's all eggs, sugar, flour, and butter. But the way in which you combine those ingredients and the kind of heat that you apply to them and the process that you use to cook them, much like a human and their development and their environment and the way in which they're socialized, that's what you end up with at the end. That manifests as either an autistic person with characteristics that you interpret in different ways, or a delicious cake or cookie that you could eat. That's, yeah.
Do you know, you must have infected me with this, because when I do my training and I talk about how best to support autistic people, I actually use a narrative of baking a cake. So it's about the not just about the ingredients that make that person, but the environment that they're in and how long they're in it for and what's in there with them and the temperature and all of those kind of things. So yeah, Amy loves cooking.
Cooking and baking is probably one of my special interests.
And I think we know each other too well now. So right then, so we're going to move on. So where does masking lead to? So Amy mentioned earlier about kind of poor mental health and high rates of suicide and those kind of things, but actually there is not only is there a research and academic link now been kind of made between those things, between masking and suicide, but there's kind of a step been missed out of that as well, I think, isn't there, which is burnout, which is autistic burnout, which is a common thing that happens amongst autistic people, but is massively under recognized, and actually in academia isn't recognized at all, apart from in one paper, is it?
Yeah, there's one research group really trying to get some research into burnout done, but otherwise it's something that is very, very misunderstood and under researched. So we don't, at the moment, we don't even really have a standard definition of what burnout is. Based on what people have said about their experiences in work by Dora Raymaker and Christine Nicolaitis, people have talked about being kind of completely exhausted to the point where you can't do the things that you used to do, and there's no point at which you maybe can foresee yourself being able to do those things. So a long-term sustained breakdown in your ability to do the daily things that you would usually do, and a lack of the ability to recover those, like the function that you had. And we don't know what causes it physiologically. We don't know how it differs to other forms of burnout that we see, so described in things like the medical literature, and whether it's a common experience across kind of other neurodivergent people as well. So some recent research that we that came out of the paper that actually I was talking about right at the beginning with the neurodivergent, autistic, and non-autistic people in regards to masking. Actually, a lot of the non-autistic people mentioned experiences of exhaustion and feeling burnt out from masking as well. As I said, it wasn't clear whether some of those people were also autistic, but there is a form of burnout that does seem to come from this long-term, sustained, trying to maintain a way of being that isn't necessarily natural. Now, I think there's probably a caveat there somewhere, without getting into a huge political discussion around modern day life and capitalist conceptions of productivity and meaningful functional ability, and how that relates to how we conceptualize our ability to do things. Because humans now, we do a lot compared to what we've done in the past. We have less rest time and a lot more productive time. And we're becoming more and more reticent to not rest, which I think certainly feeds into this idea of functionality. But losing the ability to do the things that you have done before and not knowing why you can't do those things again, that does seem to be a really common thread that pervades the discussion of masking.
It's also interesting, and I'm very conscious here that burnout is also one of my special interests as well. So again, I could be here for days talking about this kind of, especially from an anecdotal kind of community perspective. But when we think about notions around regression and stuff, which is a common kind of attachment to being autistic, it's usually kind of when autistic children are identified, it's usually because, someone's identified that there's been a loss of skills, or sometimes it could be a loss of speech, those kind of things. That actually, when you look at how the community talks about burnout, it becomes anecdotally very apparent that what happens in children could be autistic burnout as well, because those things often come at times when you're being socialized for the first time around a lot of other children. It could be a reaction, you know, obviously I don't want to get into vaccines and autism, but actually the time that people get the measles, mumps and rubella jab is, you know, it's a hefty injection, and it comes at the same time as usually children are starting to be socialized. So there's an awful lot of change and an awful lot of disruption happening in an autistic child's life around that point, which then, if you look at it from a bigger picture kind of view, you can see why a child might then be burnt out and might then lose some skills that they had previously had. So it's really interesting when you look at these kind of things, that to think that the things that we commonly think about autism actually could be reframed in a very, very different way and for very, very different reasons. And it's really key. And that's the thing where I was kind of leading with this, in terms of, you know, we have research now which is indicating that the higher rate of suicide amongst autistic people is intrinsically linked to autistic masking, that one kind of is a stepping stone towards the other. There are obviously other things come into that as well, but masking plays a major part in that. So, and that's why I kind of dropped in the burnout thing, because actually the burnout bit comes in the middle there. And it's the bit that really, really needs to be investigated, because it's kind of, if you consider, I talked earlier about the amount of physical and emotional and mental energy that goes into sustaining masking. So if you think about yourself as a mobile phone battery, so you might start on fully charged, and then, you know, as you use your different apps throughout the day, you drain the battery and the battery goes down to zero. Now, every time you charge that battery, it never gets quite back to the point where it was at fully charged ever. Once you've done it once, the next time you do it, it's slightly lower, and the next time you do it, it's slightly lower. And then sometimes it gets to the point where you might get halfway through the day and your battery's really, really low. So you have to plug in again and recharge yourself. But then you're doing more damage to the battery by doing that, because you haven't let it drain properly, and so on and so on and so on. And eventually you get to the point where that battery doesn't carry any charge anymore, and you have to plug it in all the time to keep your phone on. You know, and if you're an iPhone owner, that's a common experience for you as well. That's not because I hate iPhones, but you know, so if you use that analogy against an autistic person, that we are constantly running effectively on fumes, because every day we are sustaining a mask, we are going out into a world which is problematic for us on lots of different levels, and causes us to kind of have to suppress ourselves, and equally at the same time we're projecting versions of ourselves and constantly having to sustain that actively in our heads. It's exhausting. And then you get to a point in autistic burnout, which Dora Raymaker's study, which you kind of identified there, which they are doing further studies based on that one. They talked about the notion there that it looks very often like depression. Burnout can appear physically like depression. And for many autistic people, because they don't understand that autistic burnout is a thing, that can then offer them to, you know, you go to the doctors and the doctor will go through a checklist of what it means to be depressed. Because you have nothing else to apply to that list, you can't say, actually, that's sort of right, but it's not quite right, because there's this whole other thing. You don't know that other thing exists. So you just lean into that stereotype again and say, yes, that describes me. So many autistic children are described antidepressants. Autistic adults are described antidepressants, are sent for therapy. All of these kind of things, which actually aren't necessarily the right supports for them, because they're in autistic burnout, which is a physical thing, which can cause things like brain fog and stuff like that. But it's not necessarily depression. But when you are given the solutions for your depression, in inverted commas, and they don't work, then what do? You self-blame. I can't even get antidepressants right. You know, that's again something that I've heard so many autistic people say, you know, I've been to therapy and it hasn't worked. I've taken antidepressants and they've done nothing for me. So then you can understand why we kind of then fall into the, well, everything that I'm doing is wrong. Nothing that I am doing is going to fix this. I've got no other option. And that's again another kind of statement, that a thread that runs through the autistic community in terms of burnout and reaching that point of, I've got no other kind of way out of this, so I'm going to take that route, which is drastic. And it's not necessarily about wanting to die either. Quite often autistic people talk about wanting to kind of exit a situation and can't see a other way to exit it. It's not that they want to not be here anymore. It's more about, I don't want to exist in the way that I am existing at the moment and want another existence. And that kind of feeds into as well. There's multiple studies that have looked at the kind of average rate of death of autistic people as well. And when you take those studies and you kind of work out what that average is, we are most likely to die between the ages of 36 to 54. And then when you look at what the biggest killers of autistic people are, separate to epilepsy, which is one of our biggest killers, it's heart attack and suicide. So these are all indicators of stress and a stressful life. And this predominantly starts with not necessarily masking, but the reasons for masking. And that's the key there as well, because it's very easy to say masking is the reason for all these things, when actual fact it isn't. Masking is a reaction to the things that cause masking. And those things are the things like stigma and marginalization and invalidation, all the things that we kind of looked at earlier. So it's a big mess.
There's an excellent question here around tools that we would recommend to help a child or a teen through burnout, aside from time and patience. So would psychoeducation be helpful? I think time and patience are probably
The biggest things
of the best things that you can do. But I also think, if I think personally, and I think you would probably agree, Kieran, identifying things like immediate sensory stressors and trying to minimize those as much as possible will probably be really beneficial. And also looking at emotion regulation. So a lot of us really struggle with alexithymia and being able to identify emotions, which makes it really hard to regulate, because if you can't tell that stress is building up, then you can't start to do things to minimize that stress. And you only notice that you're stressed once you're at crisis point, like once you are so stressed that that's it. At which point people either often melt down or shut down. So I think doing some work around emotion regulation and helping them to be able to recognize stress and how that builds up. It might be that it's really difficult to identify how that feels in the body. But one of the best tips that I've ever been given by a therapist was to think about external things that help me notice. So if I think, what am I like? What am I doing? What are the things that I do when I'm not stressed? Like, what am I doing when I'm happy? And what does that look like physically? What kinds of things can I engage with? Can I sit and read a book and concentrate? Can I focus? Do I remember to eat and go to the bathroom? Do I go to sleep regularly? What does getting stressed look like? So is that I start to, as a teenager, do I start to shout at my family? Do I lose my temper very quickly? Do I look like I'm going to cry to other people? Do I start to move more? And those are kind of outside things that you can use to then kind of try and prevent yourself getting to, what do I look like when I'm really and truly about to tip over the edge into this is far too much. And by identifying that kind of in the recovery from burnout, you can start to look at putting those things in place so that they can start to recognize some of those stresses in advance and try and, before they get to that kind of red point, bring it down into amber and try and stay more in the green. And I think that's probably some of the best advice I've ever personally been given.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one more thing that I would probably add to that is, as someone supporting an autistic person through burnout, think about your language and demands. Demands are a huge part of being an autistic person anyway. And particularly if you present as someone with pathological demand avoidance, which is a kind of slightly separate thing. But demands are a huge part of our lives. And it's not only the demands that other people put on us, it's the demands we put on ourselves as well. And when you are in burnout, it's so easy to become more frustrated because yesterday you could do the thing that you wanted to do. Today you really want to do that thing, but you just can't. You haven't got the motivation or the energy or the will to just kind of get started with it. And a lot of burnout is around inertia as well. It's that literally, as autistic people, because we have this monotropic brain, which is very much like like magpies being drawn to shiny things. And then you want to find out all about that shiny thing, and you want to tell everyone about that shiny thing. When you get to that kind of point of burnout, you're unable to do that. So you lose the inertia of being able to do the things that you love and enjoy, that usually are the things that stave off autistic burnout, that you kind of can throw yourselves into. So a lot of it is around kind of supporting that person to not be too demanding of themselves, but also in your language, thinking about how much you demand of that person as well. And it might not be that you're actually making demands, but it might be the way that you're talking sounds like a demand as well. So just kind of modulating and thinking about how you're kind of saying things and doing things. But this is obviously, burnout is a completely separate talk to this to a degree, and obviously we don't want to be here for ages. But if you want some resources for autistic burnout, I will send them to Tinya, if it's okay, Tinya, and then we can you can maybe disseminate them amongst everyone or share them in your group or whatever, because I've got some good blogs where I talk about this kind of stuff. So, and some other people as well. So, and some other talks I've done which are free. So no, I'll share those with Tinya at the end.
Excellent. I think that's great. And I think you picked up there on like a key thing. I know for me personally that when I find that I can't engage with my interests on the same level that I usually would, that's when I know that I'm starting to get really, really tired and really, really stressed. Because when you can't get so into the things that you get really into, there's something going on there that isn't good. And so that's something that as a parent or as a teacher, if you can pick up on that in a younger person and notice, well, usually that they talk quite a lot about this thing, or they play this game a lot, and they haven't been doing that. They've just been kind of sitting, staring blankly. Then it's often a good indicator that someone is reaching that point where they need a bit more support.
Yeah, completely. Right, should we move on to the next one? Because I'm really conscious of time, and then we won't have time for any questions at the end. So hold on, let's get my mouse back. There we go. So is masking ever useful or positive? Are there aspects of masking which can be useful or positive? Do you want to start, Amy, or do you want me to?
I'm happy to start with this. Yes, would be the short answer to that. Which comes back to just social strategies and social affiliation. Now, I do have mixed feelings on this because, if we take something like professionalism, for example, being able to act professional in a professional environment is a form of masking. So you wouldn't speak to your boss maybe in the same way that you might talk to a friend or another coworker. Now, to a degree, I don't think that's necessarily true for a lot of us, because I know that for me, I don't recognize hierarchy very well. And I think a lot of autistic people are the same. And our ideas of what's professional and professionalism differ to neurotypical people. But being able to, change how you appear in different contexts, again, that's a normal human behavior. So if I was at the gym, I might talk more about gym activities to my gym friends than I would with friends I don't go to the gym with, because they're not interested in the same things. So that's just kind of, it's how socializing works. Masking can also be used to protect yourself from further stigma. So a lot of marginalized people have to mask. You can't just say demask, because that puts someone in danger. And I went to an excellent talk on Monday by Melissa Simmons, who talked about autism in the Black community and how a lot of Black people are marginalized and judged very heavily by external people around their identity. And if they didn't mask, they would be at risk of victimization, of violence and aggression and white supremacy. And so for a lot of people, demasking isn't something that they can safely do. Now, that doesn't necessarily make masking positive. It just means that it's something that has utility for being safe in society. Yeah, it's a tool. And we could also take examples of things like, I guess, role playing and acting. A lot of the skills that you use to mask are very similar. So I once had a particularly difficult social situation that I didn't really respond to at the time. And afterwards, I remember saying, like, oh, I'm such an excellent actress. I'm really good at not letting my feelings show to other people. Later realizing, yeah, that was a very much a learned skill. But it comes in handy for being in a stressful situation where someone might act in a particular way and you don't fly off the handle or you don't respond. You just manage to choke it down a little bit. But that it can be beneficial, you know, getting angry isn't always the best response. So yeah, I think there can be positives. I think that the problem with masking is with the fact that when autistic people mask, they're often like masking both being autistic and then that social contextual stuff. So it's not just kind of a different social strategy. It's using different social strategies whilst minimizing your identity and who you are. And that causes that disjoint and extra stress on people. And you aren't seeing that in neurotypical people, that they're not having to modulate how they appear in that same way in order to avoid stigma. And the other bit of the sentence has completely gone out of my head. There was a second thing that I was going to say, and now I cannot remember what it was. So I'm going to hand over to you. And
Okay,
let you say
while you think about that, you sit and let the hamster spin on its wheel for a little while, and then so to kind of further Amy's point there as well, there's a lot of privilege that comes with being an adult, and some of the things that we've talked about here are things that we can choose to do as adults in terms of kind of, you know, using masking as a tool, even demasking, which we'll kind of come onto in a bit. But when you are a child, you don't have as much control over your life as an adult does. Well, as a child, you have barely any control over your life at all, especially when you are a child who is going to school. School is often an environment which is very difficult for autistic children, not only because of the expectations and demands that are being put on, but the fact that those expectations and demands exist in a world which is sensorially usually really, really quite hard to cope with, where communication is happening in lots of different ways, and none of those ways are your way of communicating. You've got the social dynamics of friendships and relationships and how you exist around other children who maybe aren't as welcoming to you as they could be, and accepting of you as they could be. So you've got all of those, and plus as a child, you know, as you're developing and growing, you've got hormones and all sorts of things raging around in your body. So you've got this whole extra lack of control over your life, and you are being put in an environment that you're not choosing to be in. You haven't got the capacity to choose to go to school or not. That's something that you're told that you have to do. So then masking, you could look at masking in that environment as something which is useful because it is that form of self-protection, but also you've got to look at it in terms of what Amy was saying about kind of the ethnic minorities and people from marginalized groups who don't have a choice in that, because if they take their mask off, that makes them unsafe. So a child in a school environment who is not masking is generally unsafe. It makes them more likely to be picked on, corrected, bullied, you know, or isolated, or excluded, all of those different kind of negative narratives that come with being an autistic person that is existing authentically. And also as a child as well, you've got the fact that when you are engaged in masking, you haven't got the adult kind of processing and ability to pick these things kind of apart and be able to kind of know when you're doing something and know when you're not doing something, or recognizing that a certain situation is safe for you, or all of those kind of things. As a child, you might not have the capacity to be able to kind of pick apart those things. So quite often you find yourself in very vulnerable situations, and you find yourself doing things that as an adult you would look back on in horror, and you've got no concept of how you ended up in that thing. And a lot of that is around fawning and people pleasing and not wanting to let people down and not wanting to say no, because as a child you are told that you can't say no, and all of those kind of things. So when you kind of are masking, it very much can put you in very dangerous situations as well. And even growing up as a teenager and things like that. And that's something that you've kind of looked at, Amy, isn't it, within terms of mate crime, if you want to go into that, and interpersonal victimization and stuff like that.
Yeah, so some of the research that we've been doing, we're looking at what's called interpersonal victimization. It's sometimes referred to in the UK as mate crime. Mate crime specifically often refers to victimization and abuse within friendships, whereas interpersonal victimization takes into account other social relationships. And we found that autistic people appear to be much more likely to be abused by people they know, including family members, friends, and partners as well, which is, again, really bleak research. But what we're finding is that there's, again, this common thread for a lot of people where they're talking about their experiences of feeling like they have to please people and feeling like their needs and their desires don't matter. So they need to suppress what they want and do what the other person wants, because otherwise they won't want to be friends with them or they won't want to be in a relationship. And this is something that they've learned as they've grown up. So a lot of people have learned this kind of very early on in childhood, that this keeps them safe and it makes people want to be around them. And that's something that, if that's putting people at a higher risk, then it's something we need to prevent. So we need to make sure that people feel like they can stick up for themselves and like they can say no, be able to use their no. And for that to be meaningful to other people, so people aren't forcing them to do things and being like, well, you kind of have to, because what we're teaching children when we teach them to mask is we're teaching them how to be a good victim. And that's not something that we should be encouraging.
No.
And people look for that. So I think that's the kind of thing that it's important to say, that in our research, one of the things that we really don't want people to think is that autistic people are to blame for the abuse that they experience, that kind of it's because of acting like this or because they people please, they're victimized. Perpetrators, they use this in order to abuse people, and complex experiences feed into the likelihood of someone targeting someone for victimization. And how long that's sustained for, again, relates to very complex factors. It's not as easy as saying autistic people are victimized more because they don't understand social interaction, because that isn't true at all.
And it's oversimplified, isn't it?
Yeah, and that it is kind of a common narrative of, maybe people victimize autistic people because they don't understand. And autistic people do understand. They do know. Some people say that they're not sure about whether the way they're being treated is normal because they're being gaslit by people and told that, well, this is just how this friendship worked, which is exactly what someone said in the study we have under review at the moment. They said, they told me that's how friendships worked. And I thought that might be true. But yeah, this idea that people, they notice if you're compliant and they use that in order to manipulate and get their own way. We don't want to be teaching people to mask and teaching people that it's okay for them not to have their own rules and boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next slide, actually, to give a bit of context, the reason I used the shield wall was not because you are Danish people and I was obsessed with Vikings and things, but actually because the mask can be seen as a kind of shield as well, a protective kind of shield. So moving on from kind of that, but keeping that in mind, what can be done to mitigate masking? And I don't know actually if I phrased that in the right way when I've written that slide, because it isn't necessarily something you want to mitigate because you can't mitigate it, but maybe you can take more control of masking and use it as that shield, as a kind of way of kind of navigating certain situations and things. And one of the problems that we have is that quite often the mask is the one that's the bit that's in control. And we don't want the mask to be in control. We want the autistic person to be in control of the mask, and then it becomes a tool. It's not something that's taken over you and is kind of driving you. So, and I know Amy wants to talk about something really specific in this bit, which is really, really key. And look, she's smiling already, so that makes her really excited. So I know it's a really, really bit that you love this bit, don't you? So,
are you predicting that I'm going to talk about community connectedness?
Oh, absolutely.
Monique's work.
So talk to us about community connectedness, because this is a fundamental way of helping autistic children and adults to not have to mask as much. So what does it mean, and what can we do?
To give a little bit of intro into this, research into autistic community connectedness comes from Monique Botha, who is an autistic academic and absolutely fantastic, like is just an all-around brilliant human and wonderful person. And Monique did some research looking into essentially whether autistic people connect to other autistic people. So whether that's in person or online, whether they are in friendships, part of groups with other autistic people. And they found that autistic people who do have community connectedness, so whether that be in terms of like interpersonal relationships or politically, and politically was particularly important, so interacting with other autistic people in ways that centered around activism, those people tended to display a buffer against minority stress and marginalization. So the kind of stigma and internalized ableism that autistic people experience could be buffered by this political connectedness to other people in the autistic community. And that's such important research, showing that when we find each other and when we're able to connect with each other about our experiences and about what we want for autistic people, so about kind of these positive outcomes that we want to see and how we work together to achieve that, it helps us to break down some of that internalized ableism and move past it to where we can start to recognize our autistic characteristics as a positive thing. Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
It is absolutely brilliant. And actually it's kind of, I'm doing a talk in a few weeks which is about autistic culture and looking at being autistic as part of a culture. And the way that I kind of describe this is that we are a culture which is currently disseminated all across the planet. We're a non-geographical culture, so our culture predominantly exists on the internet and in small groups when we can come to kind of gather. And then when you look at that historically, as we've been able to connect more and more and more recently in the last kind of 10, 15 years, all those indicators of culture that I talked about earlier have started to come together. Now, when you exist within your own culture, you are more likely to be comfortable than when you are not existing within your own culture. You're going to be uncomfortable. You know, you're going to be slightly more self-monitoring, more being aware of your surroundings and what you're doing and how you're moving and behaving and communicating, all those things. But also when you exist within your own culture, you can comfortably communicate, think, feel, act, move, do all the things that you naturally need to do within that culture around those other people that are like you. So a real example of this, and this is directly connected to masking, I'm just going on a kind of a long-winded way of getting there, is that part of the way that my mask presents is through speech. Now, speech is it. You wouldn't think this because I've sat here for nearly 2 hours now waffling, but speech is not my predominant form of communication. I prefer to communicate through text, and speech is a minimal way of doing it. When I do something like this, I do talks like this because it's an easier way of communicating with lots of people, but it leaves me absolutely exhausted. Now, after this talk, I probably won't speak for the next 24 to 36 hours. And if you were to come into my house, you would see, from a non-autistic perspective, you might see a house where children are being neglected because their parents aren't talking to them. But actually that's a surface level observation, because what you would miss would be the fact that I have 3 children, my wife, and we all communicate through text constantly. We're constantly messaging each other, emailing each other. We use WhatsApp, we use Facebook Messenger, my wife and I do. Even when we're sat in the same room, we're communicating through text all of the time. That's not to say that we don't occasionally speak to each other, because we do, because sometimes it's just quicker that way. But talking is tiring. And when I talk, this is why when I do most of my presentations, I script it, because when I'm talking, I have to actively think about what I'm going to say before I say it. And I can't edit it. When I'm talking to you now, I can't now edit what I've said in the past. But when I'm writing, when I'm using text, I can think about what I want to say. I can make sure that I lay it out in a way that I know other people are going to understand. It's an effective communication tool for me. So when I am with other autistic people, I feel comfortable communicating the way that works for me. When I'm around non-autistic people, because that's not a normal, not normal in inverted commas, non-autistic style of communication, I don't feel like I can do it like that around those people. I do now as an adult, but as a child, I certainly couldn't. So to be around other autistic people makes me feel comfortable and re-energizes me as well. I was at a conference yesterday, which I was co-presenting, and for autistic speakers, and it was a really, really lovely kind of, it was online obviously, but it was a really kind of lovely day. And I said at the end of them that there's a Welsh word which I butchered it yesterday, I'm gonna butcher it today. Amy probably knows the word I'm gonna say, but it's a cwtch, which means a hug, and it also means a safe space. And that whole day felt like a hug and a safe space for me. It was a cwtch, and I kind of said that to everyone at the end, that I felt validated not only by the things that those people were saying, but even in a Zoom room, it didn't feel like I was geographically disconnected from them. It felt like I was sharing a space with them. And that's what it feels like to be autistic around other autistic people. And when you can exist like that, you don't have to mask. It's very simple not to. So from a non-autistic perspective, what can you do in order to support people? That community connectedness, enabling that, and giving people, children, adults, the opportunity to connect in that way is fundamental to them re-energizing, learning about themselves, understanding themselves, feeling given the confidence that they can advocate for themselves, and all of those kind of things.
Sorry,
Is Ragnar interrupting?
the dog
Ragnar is Amy's dog.
just flopped back and shouted, demanding belly rubs. He doesn't understand that
No.
not everything is about
That's
him.
his own culture, though.
It is, yeah. His ability to demand belly rubs when he wants them,
Uh-huh.
and to communicate with his pack. That's what he chooses to do.
So yeah, so that was obviously a long speech, but kind of, you know, that community connectiveness is fundamental. That bringing together of autistic culture and letting autistic people run with it, because traditionally we've been kept apart. Autistic children were not only put together in prescribed ways because of fear around us becoming more autistic and catching the autisms from each other and those kind of things. And it's such flawed thinking that it's an obvious thing. We enjoy being around our friends. All humans enjoy being around people that are like us, people that share our experiences, people that are interested in the same things. So why can't autistic people exist like that as well? So yeah.
Spot on.
I think we've come to the end, haven't we?
I think
we've gone so far over.
Pretty well for time. No, I think we've done pretty well. We do
Have
have
we?
one question in the Q&A that I've noticed, which I think it's a really good question. So it says, are there any studies that show how homeschooling or personal teaching is less stressful? Now, I don't think off the top of my head that anything has been done at the moment officially that's out looking at homeschooling. But I do know that anecdotally across the past year, so during COVID, that there has been a lot of people talking about how their children have been flourishing during homeschooling compared to being in kind of a formal educational environment. And I suspect that there will be studies coming out on this over the next couple of years from people who've been doing comparisons around kind of the start of the pandemic to now, and seeing children either returning to school or seeing people who are keeping their kids now out of school because they know that it's a lot better for them environment wise. So yeah, there isn't very much at the moment, but I think there will be.
Yeah, definitely. And I
Is,
mean, also on that kind of note, I and my wife took my youngest out of school in September of last year, because she had reached the point where she just couldn't cope being in school anymore. It wasn't the right environment for her, and looking back, it hadn't ever been the right environment for her. She is now flourishing in terms of her emotional well-being and her kind of energy levels and all of those kind of things, and her happiness. she's happy. And I genuinely, looking back now, I don't think she's been happy for a long time, but she wasn't able to kind of tell us that. But now looking back at things, definitely she's in a far better place being home educated than she was within school. And that's not to say that schools aren't ever right for autistic people, because for some autistic people flourish in a kind of academic environment, and but a lot of it is around the social stuff, and it's around the kind of the physical environment as well. So yeah, so there's a lot to kind of deal with there. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat as well. I don't know if Tinya's spotted
There
any.
is. I'm just popping a response in to Simone. So Monique Botha's thesis on autistic community connectedness is available online. So if you just type Monique's name and autistic community connectedness into Google Scholar, it will bring up the entire thesis that is currently being written up as different papers. I know one of them is under review at the moment and one of them is already out. But if you want to read the whole thing unfiltered with lots and lots of statistics in there, that is available online. On the topic of school, what is our view on specialist schools? I guess non-mainstream educational environments.
So obviously it depends on the school. They're all very, very individual. But I mean, in terms of the UK, specialist schools sometimes can be a much, much better environment because they are often focused on individual need rather than collective need. So obviously everyone within that special school environment will be kind of they will all have a vast variety of different needs. So it's impossible to meet everybody's needs by doing things collectively. So you have to go on an individual level. Usually the staff to child ratio is a lot higher as well. And a lot of it, depending on the school, I know there are special schools in the UK that are very much geared towards autistic monotropic thinking. They're geared around interest and they're very much child-led. And obviously, if you can access things like forest schools are really growing in the UK, and I know that they've come from kind of Scandinavia, from Sweden and Denmark, and those kind of things as well. And a more natural environment is usually a much better environment for an autistic child. We struggle with man-made sensory information most of the time, which is ironic because we've developed most of it, I would anecdotally say. But, beyond an autistic child, like using screens and tablets and things like that, actually a lot of the sensory information around us is really difficult to electricity particularly can complicate us. So being in a natural kind of green water environment, those kind of things can actually really be quite stimulating for us. So any school that's able to access things like that is going to be a much, much better place.
I think we've got a hand raised as well.
How are you seeing these things? I can't see. I'm going to stop sharing. Maybe I can see more.
I have two screens, so I have us on the bottom screen, and then the everything else on the top screen. So the hand's gone. I think I was like, I don't know how whether people can turn their mics on and ask questions or anything like that. But if anyone does have any questions, please do pop them in the chat, or feel free to ask. Let's see my big fluffy dog in the background.
I'll just have a look if anybody put questions on Facebook.
Oh yeah, of course.
Oh, we're streaming. I forgot about that.
Me too. Oh dear. It's lovely natural bird noises. I'm like, that's lovely.
Oh, sorry. I have 5 little chickens.
Oh, it sounds so nice.
There's me talking about natural environments, and there's chicks running around in the background.
Lovely.
There is one in Danish, and I'm not sure I can translate it, but I'll try. Is there difference in the energy that is used regarding to the subject? For instance, my teen son does not like to talk on his mobile phone, and only if, in that case, if it's very concrete. That's not the word because that's like cement.
No, that makes sense. Like if it's about a particular scripted topic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or an SMS. But when he talks with his old friends about exclamation mark their interests, he talks really a lot.
Yeah.
So the question is about energy and the subject.
Yeah. So when kind of our monotropic brains engage, as you've probably noticed for the past 2 hours, words come very quickly and very kind of easily. And even if you're using text and you're not using your voice, in many different ways. So it can be you use up maybe less energy. Generally, I would say you would use up less energy when you are excited and passionate about what you are talking about. And when you're talking about things that necessarily aren't very exciting for your brain, and your brain isn't really kind of interested, it takes a lot of transition to move from that to the other one, first of all. And that can use up a lot of energy, kind of transitioning from something you are interested in to something that you are not necessarily interested in. But also when you are trying to think about and focus on what someone is telling you that you're not interested in, and your brain's like, I want to be over there on the other side of the room looking at this other thing, which I'm doing right now because I can see Ragnar in Amy's background and I just want to go and give him cuddles. He's hiding now.
He's flopped down.
So you become distracted more easily and your attention's lost, and then you know, because it was wanting to go to the thing that your brain really wants to be focusing on. So to hold your attention on the thing that you're not really that interested in then uses up lots and lots of energy, because it's a kind of, you are literally physically having to hold your attention on that thing, which can make it hard when you're kind of like talking to your mum on the phone and she's telling you about the things that you need to do, and you don't really want to be doing those things. You want to be off doing the thing that you want to do. So yeah, so you can use up more kind of energy in that way. If I've understood the question correctly, that's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, I think kind of making a call to the doctors to schedule an appointment, or like calling the dentist or something like that. Sometimes that can be really difficult because you've got to think about what you're going to say and the order you're going to say it in, and what the other person might say as well. If you're talking to a friend about something that interests you, you can probably talk for, as we know, for hours. I had a call a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine. I was very tired. I'd had a very long day at work, and I was at the point where I could barely speak. I was absolutely exhausted. And I almost cancelled the call that we were meant to be having, and was about to message him and be like, oh, I don't think I can. But I didn't want to cancel because we hadn't spoken for a while. So I called him, and hours later I came off the call and I felt re-energized because we'd just spent hours talking about the kind of films we enjoy, and really just like deep diving into stuff that we're both really passionate about. And it really helped. It made me feel much more energetic. And I think that that's the case for a lot of people. When you're engaging with that stuff you love, it makes it a lot easier. We have a question in the Q&A and then a question in the side. And the burnout question came first, judging on timestamp. So we answer that one first.
You have to be fair.
Which is, what are typical symptoms on burnout and fear? So I think you are probably well placed to answer the burnout question because you've written extensively on this.
Yeah. So typical kind of, symptoms is probably the best word, of burnout. Anxiety, fear. I noticed you said not being able to sleep. But these things can come in extremes as well. It might be that you sleep more. Or it might be that you are unable to sleep because of anxiety. You might be more anxious. Things that Amy looked at earlier in terms of, struggling to regulate your emotions, and the way that you communicate might change. You might become more quick to anger, those kind of things. But from an internal perspective, also, it's things like feeling like you're walking through syrup or treacle. Your body feels heavy. It's like gravity's gotten stronger. Your joints can ache, your muscles can ache. So there can be kind of physical representations of it as well. Brain fog, I think I mentioned earlier. You can become aphasic, and to a degree where you lose words, and you can get through like halfway through a sentence and forget what you're talking about, and all of those kind of things. So if you think about times when you have maybe stressed in your life and how that's presented for you, but then you ramp it up probably like 10, 15, 20 times worse, that's what burnout kind of feels like. So, but if you're looking in terms of a child, I would be looking for things like, are they dysregulated more? Are they shutting down more? If they tend to melt down, are those meltdowns happening more frequently? Are their way of communication changed? Are they losing interest in things? Things like eating, sleep patterns have changed. All of those kind of things, they're all indicators of an autistic body going into autistic burnout. And then, over time, those things get worse if burnout isn't kind of mitigated. So yeah, but certainly things like fear and anxiety, definitely becoming more fearful of things because your anxiety levels are raised because you're dysregulated. So you're emotionally dysregulated. So yeah, so that would excellent. Thank you, Kirsten. So what was the other question, Amy?
We have 2 questions in the Q&A. So the first one is, what subjects around autism do you find most important for co-workers to young autistic adults to have knowledge about? So anything to make everyday life easier for an autistic person. Personally, I think a big one would be communication style. So a lot of the time, particularly for neurotypical people who work with autistic people, those differences in communication style can be really apparent and really jarring for somebody. So the fact that we tend to be quite blunt, very matter of fact, or interpret what people say literally means that sometimes the way in which we respond to you might not make sense, because we've read something different into what you've said. And it also might come across as being, some people might interpret that as aggressive or kind of unfriendly behavior. But that's not often the case. So I think being aware of communication differences and making an effort to kind of work through those barriers. So if someone responds to something you say in a way that you didn't expect, clarifying what you did mean, or saying, oh, I think there's been a misunderstanding there. Actually, what I meant was this. So trying to be really clear about things, I think, makes a big difference. Also being really aware of the sensory environment. So again, workplaces, I know a big one for me personally is things like lighting, and noise being in things like open offices is not really conducive to being able to work well. So if a coworker has big headphones on, kind of needs to use sensory aids in the office, or like things that help with sensory processing. So it might be things like wearing dark glasses, wearing noise cancelling headphones, things like that, just making sure that kind of you're aware of that, and that you kind of help people to feel comfortable. I think sensory info and communication are probably 2 of the biggest things.
Yeah, definitely. And then in terms of communication as well, is recognizing that things can quickly escalate because of confusion. And that's not just around the autistic person, that's also around the non-autistic person that's kind of working with that person and supporting that person. So it can be quickly that somebody misinterprets something, and that sets off a whole chain of events which end up usually with the autistic person being the one that's blamed. So it's really being aware of your own bias around that and your own kind of expectations, and recognizing that you make certain assumptions and those assumptions might not be based on fact. So it's really kind of important to be aware of that as well. And also the other thing is, never ever assume incompetence, but never ever assume competence as well. You've got to find a middle ground there, and making sure that the person that you're supporting or working with understands what you are saying. Don't ever assume that they do, but also don't just assume that because they haven't understood, it's because they're not intelligent enough or they're stupid or whatever kind of thing. That it's not necessarily their problem that they haven't understood. It could be the way that you're communicating with them, because communication ultimately is a two-way street. It works both ways. So it's really important to kind of recognize that you aren't always right and they're not always wrong, that there's a middle ground there where both of you are probably making mistakes.
There's another question here about gender. So it says, do you have opinion about the 100 genders? Is it a good thing, or could it cause problems for autistic teens because there are so many types? So I probably do have opinions on this. I think that, so gender is complicated. There are lots of different ways of experiencing gender, and the way in which people conceptualize their gender varies hugely. I don't think that's problematic for autistic teenagers, any more so than it is for any other teenager. And I don't think it's problematic. When we're young, we try on different identities. That might stay the same as we get older. We might decide, as a teen, that we are non-binary or transgender, or that we are or any other gender. And we might decide that that's it, and we stay that way for the rest of our lives. We might change our mind several times. Much the same as, I might dye my hair one color one month, and then it's a completely different color the next, which it frequently is. Yeah, I think it's a part of identity that does tend to fluctuate, and I don't think that's a problem. I think that there's a lot of gatekeeping and a lot of barriers that can come up around assumptions that autistic people don't understand their own gender because they're autistic, and that's not the case. So autistic people, we do think, might be more likely to be gender non-binary or experience their gender in a different way because they're autistic. But that doesn't make it any less legitimate as an experience. It just means that autistic people experience things in a slightly different way. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think it's a problem at all. Personally, would be my view on it. And I think people kind of deep diving into different aspects of their own identity and really thinking about that depthfully is probably a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because lots of autistic people do kind of naturally shuck off social norms, and genders are very, very based on social norms. We've spent a very long time thinking that, there were only two ways of being. And actually, the more we understand humanity, the more we understand that humanity has become very binary in its thinking, and the world doesn't work like that. So I think, as an autistic person, even myself, I've more and more started to identify as non-binary. And that's because I don't really understand what being a man is. I know what having a male body means because I have physiological differences to a female body, but I don't understand what being a man means in the masculine kind of sense. It's something that I've never really understood. I've never had a six-pack. Very obviously, you can look at me. It's never. But the notion, the societal understanding that we have of man and woman are very much framed around ideas around body shape and things like that. And then what we were talking about earlier about how certain genders are socialized and stuff like that, in terms of, if you're a girl, you like pink things, and you are told that you have to play with soft toys and Barbie dolls and all of those kind of things. And as a boy, you're given action figures. And so we're socialized into certain genders. And actually, scientifically speaking, there is no scientific basis for the male brain or the female brain. There's just a brain. It's no, there are slight physiological differences between male sex and female sex brains, but actually male brains and female brains work similarly. But when we are socialized differently, that's when the differences start to occur. So naturally, as an autistic person, I don't like social norms because they don't work for me. So therefore, when I look at gender, it just confuses me and makes me think, well, I don't fit any of these brackets. So what does that make me? So, so in terms of that, lots of autistic people think about these things unconsciously. It's just a natural state for autistic people to just think about this stuff and think, well, these things don't fit for me, so I'm just going to push that away because it's not me. So I don't think it's problematic. I think, like Amy said, there are lots of people that gatekeep gender, and there are lots of confusing elements, especially when you get trans children who do very strongly want to transition, and then people get worried about that because there is a tendency to kind of worry about autistic trans children, that we don't understand ourselves, that it's because we don't feel right within ourselves and those kind of things. And it's very, very problematic. I know so many trans kids that do completely understand who they are and what they need to be because they're not in the right body. So it's this. I think it's worth more discussion, but it's very negative at the moment, I would say.
Yeah. We've got another really interesting question, which is, are autistic people able to train certain challenges due to neuroplasticity? Which is a really interesting question. So all people are to a degree, our brains change depending on the kinds of things that we do. So if you know about neuroplasticity, you'll know that, you know, if an example would be so in my spare time, I do aerial exercise. So I like to hang upside down from a rope or a trapeze. And so the area of my brain associated with movement will have stronger connections in there coded for those movements compared to someone who doesn't do aerial. And that occurs through plasticity. So those connections are strengthened, and those links help me to be able to replicate those movements again and again. And so to a degree, if there's something that I might find challenging, then I could, like a particular movement or something like that, I could work on that to try and get better. A good example of this, specifically for something that a lot of autistic people find difficult, is balance. So I am also dyspraxic, and I have really poor balance sometimes. So someone who does like to spend a lot of time hanging upside down and doing particularly dangerous activities. It is dangerous because I often might forget which hand is which, or find it difficult to balance while I'm just stood on the floor with both feet. And I previously have trained that. And if I train it, it gets better. If I stop training it, it gets less better. Again, it gets worse. So all people can do that. Everybody can kind of strengthen connections to get better at certain things. You develop those connections through expertise. What we can't do is change the fundamental way in which our brains work, and I don't think we would want to. A lot of the evidence for kind of the neurological differences we see in autistic people is not particularly strong or consistent. So we know that our brains are different, but the evidence as to how and why is really, really varied. And the connections are different. We have different strengthened connections to neurotypical people. Theoretically, yes, things could change the neuroplasticity, but I would argue a lot of the time that we probably wouldn't want to. I guess an example where you might, so the one that often comes to mind for me is sensory stuff. So kind of on a bad sensory day, sometimes I wish I could train my brain not to hear the frequency of electricity, because it feels like I'm being pierced with a needle right through to the center. But there is nothing I can do about that. So I can't train my brain not to process that frequency. That's not the way that works. So yeah, it's a good question, and as a neuroscientist, something I find theoretically interesting. But as an autistic person, I think the answer is mostly no.
I think there's probably problematic notions around some of that as well, in terms of there are certain therapies, behavioral therapies, that are geared around that, through training, through repetition, to do certain things and develop certain skills. But you also have to take into account differences in developmental kind of processes. Now, we know that autistic people develop in very, very different ways to non-autistic people, and actually within autistic people as a group, we all develop very differently to ourselves. So, you know, if you think about the kind of the developmental charts that we get when children are babies, and we have like the line that goes up, and you know, the closer you are to that line, the better you are, kind of thing, in terms of when you walk, when you speak, when you do the things that babies do in order to kind of develop. Then autistic people are usually all over the place, and that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that. It's just our brain's prioritizing on the things that it needs to prioritize on. And when we have certain therapies that say, well, you know, we can train autistic people to become, it's basically saying that we can train autistic people to become normal. You know, we can match that developmental line if we train them hard enough. And that's really what behavioral therapies are coming from. But the danger around that is that autistic people aren't normal, in inverted commas, that we can't exist like that. And to make us exist, well, we can exist like that, but to make us do that is masking, is covering up our normal developmental processes, and makes us kind of it's so harmful, absolutely so harmful. the autistic community talks about certain behavioral therapies giving trauma and PTSD and stuff like that. And a lot of that is wrapped around that notion. It's not necessarily around the kind of praise and punishment elements of that notion, which are problematic within themselves, but also it's around the kind of, it's the development of a forced mask, which then drops off at some point because it's unsustainable. So that's where we kind of get those notions from. So yes, I mean, there are certain challenges in life that people, like Amy said, that people can get better at meeting, but much better, rather than training a person to meet a challenge, why don't you change the challenge? Why don't you frame things differently? Why don't you say, well, this person isn't great at doing it like this, so let's find another way that works for them? Or is that even a challenge at all? Is it something they have to do? Is it something they have to go through? Is there another way around it? And it's, there's a phrase that we use in the UK, which is called thinking outside the box. And lots of autistic people exist outside of that box. So you can't make them do the stuff that's in the box if we're not in the box, and we can't be in the box because we don't fit in that box. So we have to do things differently, and we have to do things in a different way. So as people who support autistic people as well, we need to help them find their own path and not force them down a particular line and over certain hurdles and challenges and barriers, because those barriers might never be achievable unless you force that person over it. And forcing people to do anything isn't a useful way of teaching anything. We learn because we're interested in stuff, and that's the best way that we learn. And for autistic people, that's the fundamental way that we learn. We have to be led by our interest in order to retain information and really kind of keep it in. So I think we can do it, but should we do it? That's the question that really needs to be kind of asked.
There's a hand raised, but I don't know whether it's a legacy hand or whether it's someone who has a question.
A legacy hand?
A legacy hand is like, it's when you press raise hand, but then it stays there. Oh no, we do. Hello.
We have a person. Hello,
We've
Carrie.
got a person.
Do you want to unmute yourself, Carrie, if you'd like to?
I have asked to unmute, but Carrie, you have to unmute your microphone yourself.
I think Carrie's struggling.
We can come back to Carrie if she can figure out if it's a technical problem. It can also just be that the hand is up by fault.
I'm just going to click ask to unmute on there and see if that helps.
Yeah, I tried it, but oh, it worked.
Hey! Excellent.
Oh, it's me. It's a mistake. I'm sorry.
Hello.
Hey, Carrie. So, did you say that you made a mistake? Oh, I think Carrie made a mistake. I don't think she meant to.
In the meantime, Anne has a question in the chat and said, "Is this available later?" And as far as I know, I think it is.
Yes.
It's been recorded, isn't it, Sonia?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely.
Are we there? Are we done, do you think?
We have some questions on Facebook.
Cool.
To explain to, for instance, social workers that one's daughter is masking and can get very overloaded, get burned out, it's very difficult to get the right help. How could one explain this to social workers?
That's an enormous question, and it is the problem that we constantly butt our heads against. Not just social workers, it's professionals of kind of all levels. You can find information about masking that's written by autistic people, which you can obviously print off. There is multitudes of research. Probably after this, it might be worth Tinya and I having a chat about kind of like what resources might be useful to share and things. So you can share those things with them. But, again, another English kind of saying is that you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Meaning that you can give people as much information as you want, but until they really understand and absorb it, it's it's kind of useless to a degree, which is a really hard thing for me to say, because this is a problem that is a worldwide problem. It's not just a problem with social workers in Denmark or social workers in England. It's a problem with social workers everywhere, that they are overworked, underpaid, and haven't been given the right training. And it's a massive problem. It's a massive barrier to families getting the right support. And also it's really problematic because social workers all over the world are making assumptions about how people behave and about how families need to do things. So yeah, it's a really kind of difficult thing, but probably the best way to do it is to get lots of resources, print them off, and literally hand people, signpost social workers to stuff. There are autistic people doing talks all over the internet all of the time, that are free to access. There are autistic people like myself who have written whole trainings, that are usually very reasonable to access. Not like, I write my training deliberately and price it deliberately so that parents can access it, because I don't like taking money off of vulnerable people. So it's lots of things like that exist, but it's maybe putting those resources in front of the social workers to help them understand these things.
I think we have another question from Mia. I think Mia probably wants to ask a question.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, I've even got a small image. How nice. Okay, yeah, hi. And thanks for sharing all your experiences and all your knowledge. It's really a nice thing to hear. I'm a mom, and I'm also autistic, and my son is 3 years old, and he's in a common kindergarten. And I think, do you have the word pedagogue in English?
Pedagogue.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they're really great, but obviously it's a neurotypical place. And of course, I don't really have the objectivity to diagnose my own son, but I definitely have enough knowledge to see that he has some difficulties, sensory and tactile and different issues. And I think it's a little bit hard to make the pedagogues see it. And my biggest fear is that I don't get him help soon enough. And also, of course, that I worry that I project because I'm autistic, or that because I have so much knowledge, maybe I read difficulties into him that he doesn't have, or I'm overprotective, or whatever the things that could come from me might be. But I think my biggest fear is that I don't get him help early enough, because I know that that's the best thing to do. But I don't know really how to make them listen, because they obviously have a different experience with him, because he's there during the day and there's lots of stimuli. So he's a different kid when he's over there. Maybe it's a little bit impossible to answer what to do, but I would just like some small input if you have any.
It's not necessarily impossible to answer. Obviously, it depends on how receptive they are to listening to you and kind of taking on your experiences. Firstly, I would say that I wouldn't worry so much about projecting. That might be your own internalized ableism popping up there and kind of making you gaslight yourself. If you recognize much of yourself in your child, that's probably because your child is a mirror of you. So they will be kind of doing the things as a child growing up that you will recognize that you did yourself, and you will recognize experiences in them. And also, autistic people are really good at spotting other autistic people usually, so especially when it's your own kind of child. So if he is having specific struggles that you can name, particularly around kind of sensory stuff, you can talk about autism without talking about autism. So you can name specific things that so I don't know, if he struggles with certain sounds, then you can go to the kind of kindergarten and say, he struggles with sounds like this. So can we make sure that he has access to something that helps him if that noise happens, or can these noises be avoided, or can you just be aware that if those noises happen, it might trigger certain behaviors? And also we can talk about masking without talking about autistic masking, because something we haven't really mentioned today is actually there's something called the Coca-Cola effect, which is where an autistic child goes into an environment, has to suppress themselves or is overwhelmed by that environment, but doesn't release it until they get to a safe place or with safe people. So if you are noticing big behavioral changes between what's happening at home and what's happening when he's not at home, then you can describe those changes. And it's a very good way of leading into, well, there's a differential there. So something's happening where he is in order to make him act in a certain way. And he's being more authentic when he's at home because he's at home more than he is at school. So, you can start pointing those things out. So I would, like I said, talk about autism without actually using the word. Sometimes it's very easy to professionals to kind of say, well, you are projecting because you are autistic, so therefore you're looking for it. But we also know that autism is genetic, and it very often does run in families. If not one parent, then probably two parents. But professionals are struggling to catch up with those things as well. So I would say, firstly, validate yourself by recognizing that you're probably not projecting. You're probably seeing an autistic child. And secondly, talk about autism without talking about autism. Be specific in what you are talking about. Amy, do you want to? Do you want to add anything more than Amy?
No, I think that was an excellent answer. And I think it's probably quite a common experience,
It is.
particularly for autistic mothers of autistic children. But you do know best. I think it's a really good thing to point out. And I did see, so it's not out at the moment, but I did review a lovely piece of work recently looking at autistic motherhood, and kind of the unique insight that autistic mothers can provide into caring for their autistic kids. And I think as the mum, you do have that insider knowledge. So if you're able to spot those things, as Kieran says, then being really specific about it, without necessarily having to, at the moment, seek a diagnosis, that's something you can look at if you want to. But yeah, I think it's a good approach to take.
And it's also to be more constructive about it, being positive about it as well, like not thinking about it as necessarily negatives. But if he learns in a particular way which suits him, then talk about that as a positive thing, that you're not looking for a label, you're not looking for negative things, that you're really positive about the way that he exists, but he just needs certain supports. And that's not too much. I mean, that's reasonable adjustments. That's not asking for too much. And if they're not receptive to those things, I would question, is it the right place for him to be? And that sounds like a very drastic thing, but if they're not going to support him in the way that he needs to be supported, then it's not necessarily that he's in the right place.
Mm.
Is that useful at all?
Yeah, it's very useful. It's just it's very good advice as well, but actually they gave me 15 minutes every week, and unfortunately I already spent those 15 minutes the past months trying to say that I don't want them diagnosed or anything, but I just want them to be able to hear it. So I mentioned autism maybe, I don't know, 50 times, and then kind of got into an arm wrestling competition where the pedagogue said normal for every time I said autism, and so it stranded a little bit. So I don't think I can really pull out autism of the equation now, because
Myanmar, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name fully. I would worry as a parent if any kind of education establishment only gave me 15 minutes a week to talk about my child's education. I'd be a little bit concerned about that. And that's coming from me when you said that, my heart kind of went, because at the end of the day, if you need to talk about your child's education for longer than that, they shouldn't be gatekeeping that. They should be more kind of open to that. So that would make me concerned. That would be a bit of a red flag for me.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but everything is so much under pressure because of Corona, so nobody else got that time at all. It's a kindergarten establishment, and they're there's too few people. They're understaffed, obviously. So I think, I don't know why I got it anyway. I know that kids are struggling more than my kid is struggling. So yeah, I think it's kind of nice that they gave it to me when they're struggling.
Okay.
And I don't know, I haven't never heard of anybody else getting that time. Of
Right.
course, it would be ideally much more, but yeah, that's just the way it is.
It's hard. It's really, really hard. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, thanks. It'll be fine. I will talk to the next pedagogue instead of the first one, and I think that will go better.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, talking to somebody different might get a different reaction.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Mia, can I just put in a short comment here? Mia, if you are, I don't know if you're a member of Landsforening Autism, because this is open to everybody, but if you are, you could contact your din lokale kreds, and ask if they could, if you need a bisidder, if you have meetings, if that would somehow help you.
Yeah. Okay. That's I haven't thought about it because yeah. But thank you. That's good.
You're welcome.
I think we've got two more questions. So there's a question here. So it's quite a long question. So I'm going to come back to that one second, because the first one's quite short, which is there any other webinars of you two talking together? Because it's been awesome. I don't think there is anything of us talking together. Kieran has, I think, lots of videos online of him talking, but this is the first time I have done anything like this.
You make that sound like I'm really kind of
I
just video myself talking all the time.
You are invited places frequently. You are very prolific. So yeah, I think you on your website might have links to talks.
I've got a I don't have a YouTube. I do have a YouTube channel, but I'm not a YouTuber. So there are recordings of me on my YouTube, which is just the Autistic Advocate, where I've done interviews with lots of different people and things. But any kind of Facebook lives and things that I do, they're on my Facebook page, and I do promote them on my Facebook page and things. But Amy and I have planned to do lots of stuff. It's just time, isn't it? And again, we want to start a podcast, but things get in the way. That's the problem.
Yeah,
we would be happy to host more of your talks. Let's just call them talks.
Hours of us talking, yeah.
And there's another really good question here, which is about support for a late diagnosed adult. So Birgit says essentially that she's been offered one-to-one support with a neurotypical person. Is there any alternative approaches to help late diagnosed adults other than physical meetings with a non-autistic person? I think, yeah, there probably are. In terms of support available, I mean, I can't stress enough finding other autistic people to talk to, whether that's through a formal organization, or whether it's just by joining things like groups where there are other autistic people that you can talk to about your experiences. Like I have said this many times to Kieran, and I will continue to say it, but meeting Kieran made a huge impact on me personally, because Kieran has helped me to be able to recognize so many things that I found stressful that I wouldn't have been able to verbalize or recognize by myself. Interacting with other autistic people has been like an absolute life-changing thing for me personally. And it is that kind of that community and that knowledge, but it's also life hacks, as you call them in like the UK and the US, so like tips for things that neurotypical people wouldn't think of. So that kind of little bits of advice that can, I never thought of doing that. I'm feeling really stressed, and someone else going, could it be this? Could it be this? That autistic insight can be really helpful. It's also like free. So finding other people to connect with isn't something that a local authority has to find for you, or that you have to pay them for. It's something that you can have and just develop those interpersonal relationships, which I think is really, really meaningful for a lot of people.
I mean, if you can afford it, an autistic counselor or therapist, or at least a neurodivergent one, someone who's got a kind of a relatable life experience to you, so that they know when you're talking about things, they're framing it and giving you advice, they're framing it in the right way that's useful and meaningful for you. Because they're able to look through the same lens that you can kind of look through. Like Amy said, being around other autistic people, there are thriving autistic communities on Twitter and Facebook. They can be quite intimidating sometimes, on multiple different levels, depending on if you use social media and depending on what platform is suitable for you as well, because not everybody can use certain platforms. I run a Facebook group for late diagnosed people, which is called, my brain has stopped working, which is called late diagnosed autistic education and support. We've got it's a peer support group, so it's not me in there giving advice to everybody, but there are lots of late diagnosed autistic people. There are lots of people at various stages in their journey, and it's although it's predominantly English speaking, there are people who are not English in there. So there are many people who are not English in there as well. So people whose first language isn't English as well. So there are huge communities existing on the internet, and also there will be autistic. I mean, obviously, unless you live in an isolated place, there will be autistic people around you as well. It might just be that you haven't found them yet. And being around other autistic people, as Amy said, is not only re-energizing and invigorating, it gives you an opportunity to learn about yourself in a very, very different way, and helps you reframe your life experiences. We take on a lot of blame for things that aren't necessarily our fault. We have negative experiences that we have blamed ourselves for. And actually, when you start reframing them through the lens that we've been talking about today, much of that isn't your problem. It's problems that other people have had as well. So, you can look at your life in a very, very different way, and actually realize that many of the barriers that you faced aren't your fault, and that it's not because something's wrong with you or that you're broken. So, and you can get that from being around other autistic people. So in terms of support like that, yes, there's training by autistic people, which is validating. I've written my own training specifically to be validating to autistic experience. And there are other people. There's another autistic colleague of mine called Christy Forbes, who does some amazing talks. She's focused very much on pathological demand avoidance. But she is also autistic, obviously, so that's very much framed around her experience and stuff. So there are lots of us out there that are doing things and offer that kind of connectedness. On a Saturday night at 8 o'clock UK time, which is at 9 o'clock your time, Aucademy, which is AUCADEMY, they run a Facebook Live every Saturday night, and they have autistic speakers come on and do different events and things. So, and stuff like this, coming to talk to us in places like this as well. So community connectedness exists on many, many different mediums and in many, many different ways. But even stuff like this can just make you feel a little bit better about yourself and give you a little bit more confidence and a little bit more understanding of you. So yeah, and it's all free mostly as well. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. So Burgess just responded and just said, couldn't agree more, like the importance of finding similar people. Academy is on Facebook, so they have a Facebook page,
Yes.
and they run events on there. But yeah, being in stressful life situations and needing that support, and not wanting to rely on people who might also be stressed. I completely understand that.
But we all do find space for each other, and that's the thing. It's like I have so many people that I'm friends with that know that they can message me and bombard me with messages, but don't expect to reply. It's enough to know that someone's there and has read it. Amy and I talk to each other all the time, and we monologue at each other, or we might not talk to each other for 5 days, and then all of a sudden, like, have you seen this? I'm so angry about this, and that sets off a whole conversation. So we all are aware that each of us have different needs, and it's about finding the people that you resonate with, really finding that kind of emotional and energy attachment with people who that you can make demands of, and they can make demands of you, but it's not going to be a demand that's going to hurt you. And if you feel okay to turn around and say, I can't do that right now, and that other person's going to go, that's fine, and not react negatively, which is the usual experience that we've had kind of growing up. Any more on Facebook, or is that everybody?
Hang on.
I'm quite impressed we've still got 63 people in the Zoom room. Do you think they've all
Thank you
fallen
for
asleep?
staying right to the end.
Can you please write the names of your Facebook group?
I think I have put it in there. Late diagnosed autistic education and support. Is that right?
That sounds about right. I'll get the link. That's probably an easy way of doing it. 2 ticks. Just chat amongst yourselves, folks.
If it's in this chat, I could copy it to the Facebook chat if I can find it.
I think it's
I've
1,
got it.
2, 3, like 4 up.
I've got it.
Have you got it?
It's
Excellent.
oh no, that's all panelists. Hold on, all panelists and attendees. There, that's the link.
Alrighty, thank you. There's a question.
Getting assist. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
That could be. We have things in the UK where people can get support in terms of having personal assistance and things, and that can be funded through social workers and local authorities. So it might be that there's stuff there, but obviously, we're not in Denmark, so we're not really sure how your system works. But there might be things that are available, and actually, Tinya might be able to help a bit more with that in terms of signposting.
Yes. Oh, I just have a question. The long question, Amy, you said you would take later on. Did you address that one? That was a really long one.
Was that Burgett's one?
Yeah.
I think that was Bridget's one. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Then,
That's the one. Yes.
unfortunately, Facebook will only let me see 4 posts at the time, even though I can see that there are 31 comments. I'm only allowed to see 4 of them for some strange reason.
That's not very nice of Facebook, is it?
No. So, well, but if there is not popping any more questions in, I guess we're about there.
I'm quite disappointed. I've enjoyed myself.
It's been lovely.
It has been lovely.
It's been really nice.
I'm just double checking at Facebook. I have a 6-year-old son with autism who's about to start school this summer. How can I work with teachers and pedagogues to try to strike the right balance between making my son assimilate and teach him how to listen and respect his own needs?
Do you want to go with that one, Amy?
That's a really good question. I think the advice that you gave before to Mia actually is probably really relevant there. So talking to the teachers about your child's needs in advance, and kind of making them aware and framing it as making the learning experience really positive for him, but also for them as well. So kind of not framing this as kind of something negative about him. But then I think the asking around, focusing on making him feel good about it. I think just reinforcing that we all have individual needs for the things that help us to flourish, and those being different between your child and other children in the class, like that. It's trying to think of another term that isn't, it's neither here nor there. But that's not an important thing in terms of, it shouldn't be something that really sets him apart in that regard. Like, his needs are equally as important as everyone else's, even if they are different.
Yeah.
So helping him to figure out what works best for him and empower him then to take that forward and make choices that are going to make him feel comfortable. I think that is important. And I know that's hard to do with a 6-year-old, because 6-year-olds often, they don't have the best insight into the things that they need because they're still developing and they're still learning about that. But maybe sitting down and helping to think about what good sensory things look like for him, and what helps him to feel like he has more energy or less sad or less anxious or stressed. All of those things helping him to recognize that in himself, and then thinking about how you can implement that in the classroom, I think will be a really good way forward.
It's also relationships with schools are also really, really important. I've experienced. Sorry, I'm losing my voice now. This is my voice starting to go now. I've experienced good relationships with schools and negative relationships with schools, and my philosophy has always been, which sounds really kind of, I don't know what the word is. I'm certainly not a word that would translate very well, but putting the school first when you communicate. So identifying the positive things that the school has done before you move on to the negative kind of stuff, if there is negative things. So it's a really kind of good way of smoothing ruffled feathers, maybe we would say, might be so school aren't then going to get their backs up. They're not going to feel about a negative coming into an experience. And it's kind of validating school, which sounds like a really silly way of doing things. And it is a silly way of doing it. You shouldn't have to do things like that. But often schools can get kind of held back by their professionalism and staying behind that veil of professionalism. Like, we are the school, we are the professionals, we know best, and you're just a mom. So you have to move around and navigate that kind of thing. So validating the teacher's experience, and also recognizing that, I come from an educational background and I know how difficult it is when you are in a class with 30 children. It's really, really hard to meet 30 children's individual needs when you are one person. So recognizing the difficulty that the teachers have and the pedagogues have in that kind of in that classroom environment, but also your child's needs are more important to you than any other child's needs. You're not worried, you shouldn't be worrying about other children, and the teacher shouldn't be taking that into account. Your child's needs are your priority, so they should be validating that as well. So recognizing that children's have different sensory needs, that children have different learning styles, and presenting that in a positive way and not a kind of negative way and a disruptive kind of way is a good way to kind of keep that relationship smooth, and making sure that communication is going backwards and forwards all the time, and it's positively charged communication as well, and there's no negative elements and things. And that can be really difficult, especially if you are frustrated with a school, because it can be really easy to kind of then, get cross and kind of things like that. But and I also find emailing is a much more smooth communication tool than talking to teachers. Talk when you have to, obviously, but in an email you can set things out in really simple steps, what you need, how it should be, how it needs to be achieved, and what you can do to help that as well. So so making life as easy in terms of communication and stuff like that as well. So and that would be kind of the strongest piece of advice that I can give, because I've seen so many relationships with schools break down very, very quickly when they're not meeting the child's needs, and the parent then goes in and says, "You're not meeting my child's needs, you need to do better." And then you can see how that could easily escalate. So it's about playing politics, really, to an extent. Are we there? Are we done?
I think so.
There's no more in the chat, is there?
No, and I think the talk will be on the page. I think Tinya will be able to confirm, but I think it's going to be, it's recorded, and I think it is also going to be translated. And yeah, put up afterwards. So if you want to share it, feel free.
With the Kieran's voice stopping, we might be considering also stopping. I do have some questions on Facebook, but okay. Is it okay with you too, Amy?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I might need to nip off to the bathroom at some point. Because
I need to feed my daughter at some point. So, but let's take a couple of more here. How can one help? This is my daughter, 19 years old. How can I help her not masking?
That's a really good question. I think I mean, the basic advice for that is just encouraging her to be herself in environments that she feels like she can safely do so. And at home is probably one of the places where she does feel safe doing that. So at least providing an environment where she feels safe to demask at home, feeling like she can stim, feeling like she can talk or kind of hold her face in whatever way that she best feels comfortable. And I guess then seeing if she then feels more comfortable dropping the mask in other environments. But it's not always going to be safe to do so.
No.
And it's not always going to be viable. But if you can encourage her to be herself in environments where she can, and I guess the other, in relation to that, in terms of encouraging her in the other relationships that she has, so outside of the family, to set good boundaries, to realize that her needs are important. It's not necessarily always about, say, putting our needs first, because that's often not how relationships work. We have to make compromises, but about finding a balance with that in relationships and being able to be herself around other people and not feel like she needs to people please, and maybe talking to her about that as well. So particularly in regards to romantic relationships, if that's the kind of thing that she would have, like making sure that she's aware of the kind of red flags to look out for in relationships, things like emotional manipulation, and gaslighting. So, someone trying to tell her that her experiences, she doesn't really know what she's talking about, or, maybe she didn't experience something the way she thought she did. Making sure she's aware of things like that so that she can pick up on that if it does happen. That, though it isn't necessarily masking itself, that compliance that might feed into it, I think is important to talk about really openly.
Definitely. And just what we were talking about earlier about community connectedness as well. It's not only helping her identify who are good friends and who are people who aren't necessarily being good friends, but also being around other autistic people as well, however that can happen, whether that's online or offline, or using interests and things like that to kind of find autistic people, because there will be autistic people who will share her interests and things. And so it's supporting her to find her kin, really. And on top of what Amy kind of said about boundaries and things like that, was just so important. So yeah, and I kind of, what I was saying earlier about taking control is really kind of key in all of this, because I talk about now when people ask me, like, what does it look like when you take your mask off? Well, I talk about having a bubble of safety that I can pick up and put down and take with me to certain places. Now, that means that I choose not to go to certain places, or I choose not to be around certain people, or when, I don't know, if, like, for my work, for example, if I'm in a meeting, I get people to come to me for the most part if I don't know who they are, because then they're coming to an environment that I can control. So, and that's my privilege as a kind of 41-year-old man, that I can do those kind of things, that I can say to people those things. As a 19-year-old, probably not so much, but as she grows older, helping her understand that if she puts boundaries in place, she can take more control of her life. That's only going to help her.
Yeah.
We have one similar, but I think we might have covered it. How can I help a 10-year-old who is masking a lot to learn her real emotions? But I think we more or less just with a twist.
Yes. Yeah, I think I talked about that kind of in the presentation, but focusing on the bits that she can identify. So for me personally, like, I don't find it hard to know when I'm excited about something or happy. That I don't struggle with. It's the negative emotions more so, like sadness and anger and that kind of thing. But kind of helping her to recognize that. So, if she does seem to you like she's sad or angry, talking about it, talking about, what's happened, and if you can tap into where she feels it. So it's like, you know, does your chest feel heavy?
Mhm.
And helping her to recognize that while she's young could be really beneficial in the long run, but also identifying those things in the environment that, okay, so she's starting to stomp her feet. She might be getting angry, but she's not realizing that she's getting angry. She's walking around the house heavier footed. And then identifying things to help her feel calmer. Whether that's like good sensory fun stuff to engage with, like weighted blankets, lovely lighting, nice soft cuddly toys and things that she can snuggle and kind of stim with. That kind of thing would be really helpful. But yeah, just working as much as you can to let her know that it is okay to show her emotions when she can identify them, and to try and help you to help her in picking that out as well. I think that's probably a good way to go with it.
Yeah. I back that up in terms of body mapping, emotional states and things. Is as someone who is alexithymic, who struggles to identify my emotions, body mapping has become really important in that, knowing that that when I'm anxious, that I feel it in my tummy, that when I'm stressed, quite often I get headaches. Because I don't know that I'm experiencing those things. I know I might be in a stressful situation, but I might not be experiencing it as stress. I might feel absolutely fine. That when I'm angry, kind of like my body posture changes and all of those kind of things that Amy said with the stomping, those kind of things. And there's no overnight quick fix to this. This is an ongoing kind of thing. But with that as well, you can work on emotional literacy as well. And there's like if you Google emotional literacy wheel, there's actually some really good resources on the internet where they break down emotions from very simple things like angry, happy, sad, and actually start splitting them off into more and more kind of more defining language, so you can start to pinpoint exactly what it, and you can track what it is that you're feeling in a kind of given moment. When you do that with body mapping as well, it can actually really kind of make you more self-aware of what's going on, which is quite a scary thing as well when you spend your whole life not being aware of what's going on. But yeah, and also remember, you know, she's a 10-year-old girl and she's probably got raging hormones right now. You know, puberty starts a lot earlier than when we think it starts. It actually starts when we're kind of very young, and it's an ongoing thing. And you know, but also so many autistic children don't understand what autism actually means to them, because you know you get a diagnosis and parents are quite often put on training. Often that training isn't very good, but parents are put on training, and then parents are left to explain it to their children when parents don't necessarily understand as well. So there are some really good gaming platforms for autistic children, if this is something that she's interested in. There's Ortcraft, which is a Minecraft server for autistic children. There's Spectrum Gaming in the UK, which is also a gaming platform for autistic young people and children, which is, you can find that on Facebook. So there will be other things in other areas depending on what her interests are, but where she can kind of be around other autistic kids and just help herself figure herself out as much as you support her for that.
There's also, which I feel like I should probably mention, if she reads English, because I don't know whether the book is translated into any other languages, but there's a book called The Awesome Autistic Go-To Guide, A Practical Handbook for Teens and Tweens by Yen Perkis, who is autistic. And I recommended this recently for a friend's daughter who is around the same age. And it has been infinitely useful in seeing, oh, other people experience these things too. And it's really helped her talk to her parents about autism and her emotions and her experiences. So I think that might be particularly handy as a resource as well. So yeah, I would thoroughly recommend that.
And the last thing that I would recommend is if you go on a website called notanautismmom.com, sorry, mom, as in an American mom, MOM. Amy, you putting that in the chat?
I am, yes.
Yeah. So Megan Ashbourne, who runs that webpage, has a huge list of children's books, young people's books, young adult books and things that are written specifically about autistic or neurodivergent children. So some of them are useful for kind of introducing autism to kids. Some of them are stories about autistic children as well. So so there are a huge amount of resources out there that can help validate her, which will then help her emotional dysregulation as well. Hold on, I'll rewrite that one because that was not right. Not like that.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
It's me translating it to English mum.
Yeah, English to
Not
English.
another mum. Not another
English
mum.
to English to Danish.
Make it super northeastern and call them a mam.
I have one. It might be one of the last ones. My daughter is in bed for days because of burnout. I think that actually might be joined to another one. How to help her. Let's see. And are there other groups, Facebook or others, about masking? Referring to parents or children? I'm not sure I quite understand the last bit of the question, but are there other groups on Facebook or other places about masking?
In terms of groups, not that I know of, but there are certain. I can probably the best thing to do is if I send you, I can send you a load of links that maybe you can share with everybody.
Yes,
Would that make
please.
more sense to do it that way?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll over the weekend I'll send you a load of links and then you can just share with whoever needs to.
Thank you. And I think we're about there. Unless someone puts a question in the chat now, then I think we're good to go.
Thank you so much.
No, it's been really, 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 really good time. Thank you.
I think we're there.
Thank
30
you, everyone,
minutes,
for listening.
35 minutes extra time. Thank you.
We knew we would go over. Always. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming and having us. It's been lovely.
We would really love to see you again because you are talking about subjects that you might have dug deeper into than what we have here in Denmark.
Yeah.
That is really, really appreciative. You will spend your Autism Awareness Day with us here in Denmark. Thank you very much. Yay!
Autism Celebration Day. Yay!
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, we'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, that was
We
lovely.
would be so happy to host you again. Thank you. Alrighty. Well, enjoy your evening, all of you. Thank you for joining in and listening, and thank you to the two of you for enlightening us with all your wisdom.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Alrighty. Have a nice night. Bye-bye and happy Easter.
Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Easter.
Bye.
Bye.